a story of power, survival, and the love no empire could contain. If you married a mafia boss to save your own life and ended up saving his entire family instead, would you call that luck or fate? Stay with me until the very end of this story, because what happens inside the DeMarco mansion will shock you. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The eviction notice was still warm from the printer when Vivian Cross read it for the third time. Standing in the hallway of her apartment building in her coat and yesterday's clothes, a cardboard box balanced against her hip containing everything she had managed to grab before the locks changed. She read the notice not because she didn't understand it. She understood it perfectly, every clause, every cold legal phrase, but because some stubborn part of her brain kept expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less final. They didn't. The super had been apologetic in the way men are apologetic when they're embarrassed to be the instrument of someone else's cruelty. He'd handed her the box himself. He'd said he was sorry. He'd meant it, which somehow made it worse. Vivian was 34 years old. She had a doctorate in child psychology from Columbia. She had spent 11 years building a private practice in Midtown Manhattan, a practice that had treated the traumatized children of Wall Street executives, the anxious sons and daughters of celebrities, the broken kids nobody wanted to talk about in public. She had been good at it. She had been, without vanity, exceptional at it. And 14 months ago, her business partner, David Chen, whom she had trusted with her finances, her referrals, her reputation, and at one low and poorly reasoned point, her bed, had quietly emptied their joint business accounts, forged her signature on a series of loans she had never agreed to, and disappeared to Lisbon with a woman Vivian had considered a mutual friend. The professional licensing board was still investigating. Her malpractice insurance had lapsed because David had stopped paying premiums while continuing to pocket the invoices. The civil lawsuit she'd filed was moving at the speed of geological erosion. Her personal savings, which she had believed to be separate and protected, turned out to be not quite as separate as she had believed, because David had been very thorough and Vivian had been very trusting in a way that still made her jaw clench when she thought about it at 2 in the morning. She thought about it at 2 in the morning often. The apartment lease had been in David's name, a detail she hadn't thought mattered when things were good. It mattered now. The new owner of the building had purchased the unit and wanted it vacant within 30 days, and that 30 days had ended this morning at 9 a.m. It was now 9:47. Vivian shifted the box to her other hip and walked toward the elevator with the particular deliberate calm of someone who is using every functioning muscle in their body to keep themselves from sitting down on the floor and not getting back up. She had $212 in a checking account. She had a duffel bag and a storage unit in Queens containing her clothes, her diplomas, her mother's jewelry, and a framed photograph of herself at her dissertation defense. 27 years old, exhausted, triumphant, completely unprepared for the specific way the world intended to humble her. She had no job, she had no apartment, she had a temporary license to practice psychology that could be suspended at any point pending the outcome of the board investigation, which meant she couldn't even take emergency clinic work without risking what little professional standing she had left. What she had was a meeting in 40 minutes at a law office in Tribeca she'd never heard of, requested by an attorney she'd never met, on behalf of a client whose name had not been included in the correspondence. Under normal circumstances, Vivian would have done more research before agreeing to attend. These were not normal circumstances. She had done some research. The firm, Castellan and Rourke, was real, reputable, and expensive. Their specialties included corporate litigation, estate law, and what their website described with considerable discretion as high net worth family counsel. The attorney who had contacted her, a man named Gerald Rourke, had 30 years of experience and a list of notable clients that included several names she recognized from the financial pages. None of this told her anything about who wanted to see her or why. She'd gone anyway, because she had $212 and an eviction notice, and the particular desperation of someone who has exhausted all their better options. The law office occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Hudson Street and smelled like old leather and money. Not new money, which smells like ambition and cologne, but old money, which smells like certainty. The receptionist had been expecting her. The conference room she was led to was large and quiet, with a view of the Hudson between the buildings, the river gray and restless under a November sky. Gerald Rourke was a compact man in his early 60s with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades making sure nobody could read his face. He shook her hand, gestured to a chair, and placed a slim folder on the table between them. "Dr. Cross," he said, "thank you for coming." "I want to know who your client is before we go any further," Vivian said. Rourke looked at her with an expression that suggested he appreciated directness, even when it complicated his preferred sequence of events. "My client values his privacy considerably. He asked me to provide context before his name enters the conversation." Context. He is a widower. He has 2 daughters, ages 7 and 12. He recently received a court order requiring him to establish stable household guardianship for both children within 90 days, or the children will be placed in the custody of their maternal grandmother. Rourke paused. He is contesting the order, but the court has determined that his current domestic arrangements are inadequate. The court's specific concern is the absence of consistent parental guidance, particularly given the emotional needs of his younger daughter. Vivian watched him. "You're describing a custody dispute." "In part." "And you need a child psychologist to provide an evaluation or expert testimony." Rourke folded his hands on the folder. "Not exactly. My client is looking for something more immediate and more permanent. He has reviewed your credentials extensively. Your specialty in childhood trauma, your published research on grief response in children who've experienced parental loss, your clinical outcomes before your practice was disrupted." A pause. "He believes you are uniquely qualified for what he needs." "Which is what, exactly?" Rourke opened the folder, slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Vivian looked at it. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. It was a marriage contract, not a job offer, not a consultation agreement. A marriage contract, several pages long based on the thickness of the document, with this first page serving as a summary of terms. Her name appeared in one of the designated fields, filled in already in clean printed type. "He would like to offer you," Rourke said carefully, "a structured arrangement, a legal marriage to be filed and recognized by the state of New York. You would serve as wife in a formal capacity and as a consistent parental figure for his daughters. In exchange, you would receive a salary of $250,000 per year, full legal clearance of the debts currently attached to your name through the fraudulent actions of your former partner, which my client's legal team has reviewed in some detail, reinstatement support for your professional license, and the resources to rebuild your practice on your own terms once the immediate situation has stabilized." The room was very quiet. The river was gray outside the window. Vivian's box of belongings was sitting on the chair beside her. She could feel the edge of the eviction notice through the cardboard. "Who," she said, "is your client?" Rourke met her eyes. "Lorenzo DeMarco." She knew the name. Everyone in New York knew the name, in the same way everyone knew certain streets in certain neighborhoods, certain buildings, certain silences that meant something different than ordinary silence. The DeMarco family had existed at the borderline of legitimate and criminal enterprise for 3 generations. Lorenzo DeMarco had taken control of the family's operations 8 years ago at the age of 32 under circumstances that were widely discussed and never officially proven. The family owned commercial real estate, shipping infrastructure, a pharmaceutical distribution company, 2 hotel chains, and an assortment of other interests that formed a complicated map of legal and illegal income streams that law enforcement had been attempting to untangle for years. Lorenzo DeMarco had been photographed at mayoral fundraisers and hospital galas and charity auctions. He had also been named, unproven, in connection with 3 murders, the disappearance of a federal informant, and the systematic intimidation of 2 separate rival criminal organizations who were no longer operating in New York. He had a wife. He had had a wife. Sophia DeMarco had died 4 years ago. Vivian remembered it vaguely. It had been in the papers, not as a crime story, but as a society notice. The beautiful young wife of the powerful businessman, dead at 30 from complications during childbirth. The baby had not survived either. 2 daughters, the ones who had survived, a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old. Vivian pressed her fingers flat against the table, feeling the cool solidity of it. "I want to speak with him directly," she said. Rourke nodded slowly, as if this was what he'd expected. He anticipated that. "He's available this afternoon." Bought. The car that collected her from the law office was black and unmarked, and driven by a man who introduced himself as Vincent and spoke no further words for the duration of the 30-minute drive north into Westchester County. The DeMarco estate sat behind a gate and a wall and a row of old elms that had been there long enough to forget what the world beyond them looked like. The house itself was enormous, in the way that houses are enormous when they have been added to over generations by people with money and unresolved feelings about expressing it. Wings, extensions, a formal garden that had gone slightly wild at the edges, everything built for a permanence that was both impressive and, Vivian thought as she walked through the front door, vaguely suffocating. She was led through a hallway and into a library. The library smelled like paper and wood smoke and something faintly chemical underneath, like cleaning products applied recently and in volume, which made her nose register something she filed away without quite articulating. Lorenzo DeMarco was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered. He turned. He was taller than his photographs suggested, or perhaps it was the room and the quality of the light, which was failing and cold in the way November light fails in large old houses. He was 40 years old. He had the kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had since become something more complicated. The bones still good, the expression overlaid with something that had nothing to do with appearance. He looked, Vivian thought in the first second of seeing him, like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had simply stopped noticing the weight. He looked at her the way she suspected he looked at most things, as a problem to be assessed and, if possible, solved. "Dr. Cross," he said. His voice was even, low. "Sit down." "I'll stand," she said. Something moved in his face that might have been surprise and might have been the opposite of surprise. He nodded once and moved away from the window, settling into a chair behind a desk with the unhurried ease of someone who does not experience the world as a place that requires him to hurry. "You've read the contract," he said. "Your attorney summarized it. Then you understand what I'm offering." "I understand what you're offering financially," Vivian said. "What I don't understand is why me specifically. There are any number of women in this city who would agree to a convenient marriage with a wealthy man without requiring the specialized credentials." "I don't need a convenient marriage," Lorenzo said. "I need someone who can help my daughters." He said it the way people say things they have been avoiding saying for a long time, flatly, quickly, without inflection, as if stripping out the emotion is the only way to get the sentence out at all. "Elena is 12. She hasn't spoken to me in 14 months. She blames me for her mother's death, and she's not entirely wrong to. Mia is 7. She has nightmares every night, and she's been seeing 3 different therapists in the past 2 years, and none of them have been able to reach her." A pause. "She stopped eating regular meals 6 weeks ago. She told the housekeeper that she eats when she feels like it. She weighs 44 pounds. Vivian absorbed this. She kept her expression neutral, but something in her chest moved and settled differently than it had before. "The court order," she said. "The court order exists because my mother-in-law filed a petition claiming I'm an unfit parent. She brought evidence. Not all of it fabricated. My daughters are struggling and I haven't—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I haven't handled it well." "Why haven't you?" The question landed in the room. Lorenzo looked at her steadily. "That isn't part of this conversation." "It might be part of whether I agree to it." Another pause. The silence was the kind that people fill with movement, fidgeting, looking away. Lorenzo did none of those things. He simply waited, watching her, as if he had all the time available in the world, which she suspected was one of the more effective things about him. "I have been told by multiple therapists," he said finally, "that I have difficulty processing grief in productive ways. They have been, in the main, correct." He said it with a precision that made the sentence somehow more honest than a more emotional statement would have been. It was the admission of someone who respects the truth enough to deliver it stripped of decoration. "My daughters need someone consistent and qualified who will not be frightened away by this family's circumstances. I need my daughters to have a stable home environment on record before the next court date, which is in 11 weeks. And you want that person to also be your wife. The court is less interested in an employee, however well qualified, than in a spouse. The distinction matters for the guardianship determination. Vivian walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down. She put her box on the floor beside her. She looked at Lorenzo DeMarco across the polished wood of his enormous desk and thought about everything she had lost and everything she was being offered, and the two children in this house who hadn't been mentioned in any of her research and who were apparently not eating and not speaking and not sleeping. I need to meet them, she said. Before I sign anything, Vivian said. I need to meet your daughters. Not a supervised introduction, not a formal meeting. I need to spend an hour somewhere in this house while they're present and see for myself how they move through their environment. Lorenzo studied her for a moment. Most people who come to this house don't make demands within the first 10 minutes. I'm not most people, Vivian said, and I suspect you already know that given how thoroughly you've apparently reviewed my credentials. For the first time, something shifted in his face that was not quite an expression, but was adjacent to one, the shadow of a smile that had not quite decided to become a smile. Tomorrow morning, he said. Breakfast. The kitchen, not the dining room. They're more comfortable there. Fine, Vivian said. And Dr. Cross? He held her gaze. If you're expecting warmth or openness or any conventional version of, I'm expecting nothing from you, Vivian said. I've learned that expecting things is expensive. She picked up her box and stood. I'll be here at 8, dusk. She spent the night in a budget hotel in White Plains on the last functional credit card she had. A card with $400 of available credit and an interest rate she didn't look at because looking at it would require her to think about the future in a way she couldn't afford to do right now. She lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Lorenzo DeMarco's face when he talked about his daughters. Not the careful control of it, the thing underneath the control. The particular strain of a man who is actively preventing himself from feeling something very large because he has decided, on some deep and probably unreachable level, that feeling it will destroy him. She knew that pattern. She'd treated it in children and observed it in adults, and recognized it now the way you recognize a street you've walked down before, even when you're approaching from a new direction. She also thought about a 7-year-old girl who weighed 44 pounds and said she ate when she felt like it. The specific language of a child who has learned to wrap control around herself like armor. The specific language of a child who has lost something so enormous that managing small things, when to eat, when to sleep, when to speak, has become the only territory where she feels safe. Vivian had spent 11 years inside the minds of children who were hurting. She knew what that sentence cost to say. She knew what it cost not to say. She did not sleep well. She didn't expect to. At 7:15, she was dressed and in a cab heading back toward the estate because she'd decided, not with her head, which had objections, but with the part of her that had gone into this field in the first place, the part that David Chen and Gerald Rourke and $212 had not managed to extinguish, that she was going to say yes. The kitchen was large and plain by the standards of the rest of the house, warm in a functional way, with a long oak table and a window above the sink looking out at the November garden. A woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pulled severely back was producing eggs at the stove with the focused efficiency of someone who considers distraction a character flaw. She looked at Vivian when she entered and said nothing, which Vivian registered as a specific kind of disapproval that she filed alongside the rest of the morning's information. The 7-year-old was already at the table. Mia DeMarco was small, smaller than Vivian had prepared herself for, even knowing the numbers. She sat with her feet not quite reaching the floor, wearing pajamas with a cartoon pattern that had been washed so many times it had blurred, and she was methodically rearranging a small pile of raisins on the placemat in front of her into a pattern that Vivian could not immediately identify. She did not look up when Vivian entered. Vivian sat down at the opposite end of the table. Not next to Mia. That was too much, too fast, and she knew it without thinking. She sat where she could be in Mia's peripheral vision without being a direct presence. "Good morning," she said generally to the room. The housekeeper, whom Vivian would later learn was Mrs. Harrow, 23 years with the DeMarco family, absolute authority in the domestic sphere, warmth hidden beneath approximately 4 feet of institutional permafrost, said, "Good morning," in a tone that conveyed the information without the sentiment. Mia did not say anything. She moved a raisin 3 millimeters to the left. Vivian looked at the pattern. 12 raisins, arranged in a rough circle with 4 in the center. "Is that a face?" Vivian asked. Mia's hand stilled. "The 4 in the middle," Vivian said. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, and the circle around them. Silence. Then, without looking up, "It's not a face." "What is it?" A longer silence. "A planet," Mia said, "with moons." "How many moons?" Mia counted. 8. A pause. "Saturn has 82, but that would take too many raisins." "You'd need a lot of raisins," Vivian agreed. Mrs. Harrow set a plate of eggs and toast in front of Vivian and withdrew to the counter with the air of someone who is listening extremely carefully while appearing to do something else entirely. Vivian ate. Mia continued her planetary construction. The kitchen was quiet in a way that felt less like emptiness and more like the particular held-breath quality of a space that is waiting. The older girl arrived at 8:22, which Vivian noted without looking at her watch, having been covertly watching the kitchen doorway. Elena DeMarco was 12 and carried 12 years the way some children carry them, heavily, with the awareness of someone who has already learned that the world is not organized around her comfort. She was dark-haired, sharp-featured, with her father's quality of stillness and something in her eyes that had no business being in the eyes of a 12-year-old, a flatness that isn't natural to children, and that Vivian recognized immediately as the scar tissue of unprocessed grief. Elena saw Vivian and stopped. "Who is she?" Elena asked Mrs. Harrow, not looking at Vivian. "A guest," Mrs. Harrow said. "A guest or a candidate," Elena said. The kitchen was very still. "Elena," Mrs. Harrow said, with a quality in her voice that was not quite a warning. "It's fine," Vivian said. She met Elena's gaze directly, without flinching. Both, actually. "I'm Dr. Vivian Cross. Your father has made me a proposal. I haven't agreed to anything yet." Elena looked at her with the bright, dangerous attention of a child who has learned to assess threat quickly. "A proposal?" "Yes." "And you came here to meet us first?" "Yes." "To see if we're worth it." The words landed hard, and Vivian understood exactly what Elena was doing with them. Putting herself in the position of object, of evaluated thing, as a preemptive defense against the specific hurt of being evaluated and found wanting. It was a move Vivian had seen dozens of times in her practice, and it was as heartbreaking now as it had ever been. "No," Vivian said. "To see if I can help. Those are different things." Elena sat down as far from Vivian as the table would allow. She pulled her phone from her pocket and appeared to give it her complete attention. Vivian didn't push. She turned back to her eggs. After a moment, Mia said, "Jupiter has 95 moons." "That's a lot of raisins," Vivian said. "I'd need a bigger table," Mia said. Elena lowered her phone by approximately 3 millimeters and looked at her sister, then at Vivian, then back at her phone. Said nothing, but she put the phone face down on the table. She signed the contract at noon. Gerald Rourke walked her through the complete document in an office adjacent to the library. Lorenzo present, but seated away from the table, looking at nothing in particular outside the window. The terms were as his attorney had described. The marriage would be legally registered. She would occupy the east wing of the house, separate from Lorenzo's quarters. She would function as primary parental presence for Elena and Mia. The arrangement would continue for a minimum of 2 years, with options to extend or dissolve by mutual agreement. There was a section regarding public appearances and representation at social engagements that Vivian read carefully and then read again. There was a section regarding confidentiality that she also read carefully and that told her more clearly than anything else in the document exactly what kind of world she was entering. She signed it. Lorenzo signed it across the table from her. He signed with the economical speed of a man who signs many documents and has long since stopped treating the act as significant. He capped his pen and looked at her. "The wedding will be private," he said. "Immediate family and necessary witnesses only. We can manage the legal registration within the week." "All right," Vivian said. "There are some things you need to understand about this household," he said. There are men on the property at all hours. Security, you don't need to interact with them. You don't discuss what you see or hear in this house with anyone outside of it. Mrs. Harrow runs the domestic side, and her authority is absolute within the house. If you have a conflict, you bring it to me." He paused. "You'll have everything you need. You'll have access to medical care and legal support and whatever resources are relevant to your work with the girls. What you won't have—" "I know," Vivian said. He looked at her. "I won't have your trust," she said, "and I shouldn't expect your heart. You were going to say something like that." The room was quiet. "Yes," Lorenzo said. "Then we understand each other," Vivian said. She didn't ask him if he was sure. She didn't thank him. She picked up her copy of the contract, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. And she thought about Mia's raisin planets and Elena's phone face down on the table. And she thought about what it cost to be 12 years old with a wound that size and nowhere to put it. She thought about it the way she thought about all the children she'd ever treated, clinically, professionally, with the part of her brain that knew how to build distance. Then she let herself feel it, briefly and fully, the way she always had to feel it to do her job properly. Then she put it away. The wedding happened on a Thursday morning in the first week of December, in the living room of the estate with the civil officiant, Gerald Rourke, Mrs. Harrow, Vincent the driver, and two other men whose function Vivian understood without being told. Mia sat on the settee beside Mrs. Harrow in a dress that was slightly too big and held a small winter bouquet she'd assembled herself from the garden, mostly dried things, and one stubborn rose that had refused to acknowledge November. Elena stood by the window with her arms crossed. Vivian wore a navy dress she'd bought at a consignment shop in White Plains with the first installment of her salary, which Lorenzo had deposited 2 days after she signed the contract without announcement or discussion. The dress fit well. She had brushed her hair. She had made herself presentable in the way that people make themselves presentable when they are doing something very large and very frightening, and want to give themselves as few additional problems as possible. Lorenzo wore a dark suit. He stood beside her at the appropriate distance and spoke the appropriate words when asked to speak them in the same measured, controlled way he seemed to do everything. When the officiant declared them married and paused, in that small, culturally ingrained pause that exists because most people fill it with a kiss, Lorenzo turned to her with an expression that was not unkind and extended his hand. She shook it. Mrs. Harrow made a noise in the back of her throat that might have been anything. Mia held up her bouquet. "For you," she said to Vivian. Vivian took it. "Thank you," she said. "It's beautiful." "The rose is dying," Elena said from the window. "It'll be dead by tomorrow." "Most beautiful things don't last," Vivian said. "That doesn't mean they aren't worth having." Elena stared at her. For 1 second, one fraction of a second, something moved in her face that was not the controlled flatness she'd been wearing since the morning in the kitchen. Then it was gone, and she looked back at the window and at the garden and at the gray December sky beyond the wall of old elms. Mia pressed the bouquet into Vivian's hands with both of her small, light-boned hands, and Vivian held it carefully and did not let herself think about the fact that she was now the wife of Lorenzo DeMarco, that she was standing in a room full of people who would not explain their full occupations, that she had signed a contract governing the parameters of her own marriage, that she was 44 days past broke and living by the grace of an arrangement that could dissolve by mutual agreement at any time. She held the bouquet and looked at the dying rose and thought, "Start here. You always start where you are." That night, Lorenzo stopped her in the hallway outside the East Wing. "There is one more thing I should have said this morning," he said. She waited. "You're my wife, only on paper," he said. He said it the way he'd signed the contract, efficiently, without particular emotion, as if saying it cleanly was a kindness. "Don't expect my trust, and never expect my heart." Vivian looked at him for a long moment, in which she catalogued the set of his jaw and the careful control of his expression, and the fact that he was saying this to her in a hallway rather than saying it in the officiant's living room because he had needed to say it but had not been able to say it in front of his daughters. "Okay," she said, and she went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the east wing of the DeMarco estate and looked at Mia's bouquet, which she'd put in a glass of water on the bedside table, And she thought about what it meant to be somewhere like this, in a life like this. And she thought about all the reasons she'd said yes. And she thought about the specific weight in Lorenzo's voice when he'd described his daughters. And she thought about the dying Rose. She had expected nothing. She had asked for nothing beyond what was written in the contract. But sitting in the quiet of the East Wing with the house settling around her in the way old houses settle, with creaks and sighs and the low, distant sound of security personnel moving on their rounds, she became gradually, quietly certain that nothing in the DeMarco estate was going to stay exactly as it was. The question was what it would become. The question was at what cost. She lay down, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Down the hall she heard a sound, small, rhythmic, a child moving in sleep, shifting, resisting. And then, barely audible through the walls, the soft particular sound that she had learned to recognize over 11 years of clinical work. A child crying in the way children cry when they have learned not to be heard. Vivian sat up. She sat very still, listening. The sound came again. And then, muffled, almost inaudible from what she estimated was Mia's room, a small voice saying something over and over, words she couldn't make out through the walls. She stood. She put on her shoes. She stood at her own door for a moment with her hand on the knob, thinking about boundaries and professional distance and the terms of an arrangement she'd signed 12 hours ago. Then she opened the door. She was halfway down the hall when a door opened at the far end. Not Mia's door, but Elena's. And Elena appeared in the hallway in her pajamas, moving toward her sister's room with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times before, who has been the one who gets up, who has been the available person in the absence of other available people. Elena stopped when she saw Vivian. They looked at each other in the dim hallway. "She has nightmares," Elena said after a moment. Her voice was flat, informational. She was not asking for help. She was filing a report. "I heard," Vivian said. A pause. "She usually calms down faster if someone sits with her," Elena said. "She doesn't like talking, though. She just likes company," Vivian said. Elena looked at her. "Yeah," she said. "Company." Another pause. Elena glanced toward Mia's door, then back at Vivian, calculating something Vivian couldn't quite see. "I'll go," Vivian said. Elena's chin came up slightly. "You don't have to." "I know," Vivian said. "Go back to sleep." Elena did not move. She stood in the hallway watching as Vivian walked to Mia's door and knocked softly and pushed it open. And she was still standing there in the hallway when Vivian slipped inside and pulled the door closed behind her. In the dark of Mia's room, the little girl was sitting up in bed, wrapped in her blankets, her eyes wide and unfocused, in the particular way of children who are caught between sleep and waking. Her hair was wild. She was breathing too fast. Vivian sat down on the edge of the bed, at the right distance, not too close. "Hey," she said, quietly. "I'm here." Mia stared at her. Then she said, in a voice that was smaller than any voice Vivian had heard in a long time, "I dreamed about the dark again." "The dark was loud?" "The dark was quiet," Mia said. "That's worse." Vivian thought about this. "Yeah," she said. "I think you're right." Mia looked at her with the exhausted, raw attention of a child who is very tired and not at all sure she can trust the person in front of her. "Will you stay?" she said. Vivian looked at this small, light-boned child who had been assembling planets out of raisins this morning, who had pressed a dying rose into her hands at a wedding she hadn't chosen, who weighed 44 pounds and said she ate when she felt like it. "Yes," Vivian said. "I'll stay." She pulled the chair from the corner to the side of the bed and sat in it and listened to Mia's breathing slow. She listened to the house around them. The security rounds, the settling walls, the distant sound of movement that told her Lorenzo was still awake somewhere in the far wing, the way she suspected he was always awake, carrying whatever he carried in those hours when there's no one left to perform control for. And she sat in the dark with a 7-year-old who was afraid of quiet darkness and thought, this is where it starts. Not with Lorenzo, not with the contract, not with the money or the mansion or the complicated machinery of a criminal empire. Here, in this room, with this child. She had no idea what was coming. She had no idea what this family was going to cost her, or what she was going to cost them, or whether any of them were going to come out the other side of whatever this was intact. What she knew was that she was going to do her job, and her job in that room, in that moment, was to stay. Outside in the hallway, she could hear nothing, but she knew Elena was still out there, because she knew Elena, already, after 2 days, well enough to know that Elena did not leave until she was certain. She knew that Elena had spent 14 months being the one who got up, being the available person, being, in the absence of other available people, more than a 12-year-old should have to be. That was going to change. That was going to change starting now. Mia's breathing deepened and slowed, and her small hand, moving in sleep, found the edge of Vivian's sleeve and held onto it loosely, the grip of a child who has learned not to ask for too much. Vivian sat very still and let herself be held onto. Down the hall, somewhere in the far wing, Lorenzo DeMarco was awake in the dark, alone with whatever he had been alone with for 4 years, and Vivian could not help him with that tonight. But she was starting to understand that eventually, one way or another, she was going to have to try. 3 hours later, when Mia was deeply asleep, Vivian eased her sleeve free and stood and moved toward the door. She opened it. Elena was gone. The hallway was empty. On the floor outside Mia's door, neatly placed, was a folded blanket. Vivian looked at it for a moment, then she picked it up. She stood in the hallway with the blanket in her arms and looked toward the door of Elena's room, closed and quiet, and she thought about a 12-year-old girl who had put a blanket in a hallway rather than ask for anything. She thought, that one is going to be harder. She thought, I know. She went back to her room. She lay down and pulled the blanket over her, still in her clothes, and she lay in the dark and thought about what Mrs. Harrow's expression had been during the wedding. Not the disapproval she'd read in it first, but something else underneath, something she couldn't quite name yet. She thought about the particular way Lorenzo had said the word daughters, the weight in it, the distance he kept from that weight. She thought about what a man does when he loses a woman he has loved and cannot look at the things she left behind without feeling the full specific gravity of that loss. And when the things she left behind are not objects, but children who have her eyes, her hands, her way of tilting their heads when they're uncertain. She thought about that for a long time. Then she heard it, a sound from the garden below, barely audible through the east wing walls. The sound of a door opening and closing, and then footsteps on stone. Slow, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who is not going anywhere, just walking in the way people walk when they are trying to outpace something that lives inside them and can't be outpaced. She lay there listening to Lorenzo DeMarco walk in the dead garden in the middle of the night, alone, in the cold, and the sound of it was so quietly devastating that she had to close her eyes. She had expected nothing. She had asked for nothing. But lying there in the dark with a borrowed blanket and the smell of a dying rose on the bedside table, Vivian Cross felt the very first fracture appear in the wall of professional distance she had built over 11 years to protect herself from the specific cost of caring too much. It was a small fracture. She told herself it didn't matter. She was in the privacy of her own chest, not entirely sure she believed it. The footsteps in the garden continued, slow and steady, going nowhere, and the December cold pressed against the windows of the east wing, and somewhere down the hall, Elena DeMarco slept with the exhausted, wary sleep of a girl who has been on watch too long. And Vivian lay in the dark and thought, 11 weeks to the next court date. 11 weeks, and somewhere outside this estate, a woman named Rosa Cavallo, Sofia DeMarco's mother, the grandmother of these two girls, the woman who had filed the petition, was building a case. Vivian had read the name in the contract's legal exhibits. She had noted it and set it aside. She noted it again now, in the dark, in the cold, with new awareness. Rosa Cavallo had filed a custody petition on the grounds that Lorenzo was an unfit father. What Vivian had signed up for was the domestic counterargument to that petition, the visible presence of stability, the qualified professional in the household, the documented parental care. What Vivian had not yet understood, lying in a strange bed in a house she did not know, was that Rosa Cavallo was not going to accept a counterargument. Rosa Cavallo, she would learn, was not the kind of woman who accepted anything. And the next morning, while Vivian was making oatmeal in the kitchen with Mia supervising the raisin-to-oat ratio with scientific seriousness, Lorenzo's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something crossed his face that Vivian had not seen on it before. Not control, not calculation, but something raw and quickly suppressed. A flash of something that looked, from where she was standing with a wooden spoon in her hand, very much like fear. "I have to take this," he said, and left the kitchen. Mia looked at the door he'd gone through. "He looks like that," Mia said. "When it's bad news." Vivian looked at the door. "What does bad news usually mean in this house?" she asked. Mia was quiet for a moment, rearranging raisins on the counter. "It means something's coming," Mia said. Vivian looked at the door where Lorenzo had disappeared and the wooden spoon was still in her hand, and the oatmeal was beginning to bubble on the stove, and somewhere in the house a phone call was happening that she was not part of and could not hear. And that was already, she could feel it in the quality of the air, already changing things. Something was coming. She just didn't know yet what it would cost to face it. The call lasted 9 minutes. Vivian knew because she watched the clock above the kitchen stove without meaning to, stirring oatmeal that had long since passed the point of needing to be stirred, while Mia arranged raisins into the shape of a comet on the countertop, and Mrs. Harrow moved through the kitchen with the contained, deliberate efficiency of a woman who has learned to make herself very quiet when the house is listening. 9 minutes. Then the sound of Lorenzo's footsteps returning down the hallway, slower than when he'd left, which told her more than his face did when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Vivian, just for a second. Then he looked at Mia. "Good morning," he said to his daughter. Mia looked at him with her careful, measuring look. "You sound like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like when you're trying to sound normal." The kitchen held that sentence for a moment. Lorenzo did not answer it. He poured coffee from the pot Mrs. Harrow had already made and stood at the counter drinking it with his back partially turned, and Vivian watched the line of his shoulders and thought, whatever was on that phone, it landed hard. She served the oatmeal. She put a bowl in front of Mia and watched the little girl pick up her spoon with the tentative relationship to food that Vivian had been quietly cataloging since the morning in the kitchen 3 days ago. Mia ate 4 spoonfuls and stopped and looked at the bowl. "More raisins," Vivian said. Mia looked up at her. "In the oatmeal. More raisins makes it better." Vivian slid the container across the table. "You can do a planet in the bowl. More accurate than the counter because it's round." Mia looked at the bowl, looked at the raisins, picked up a small handful and placed them carefully, with the deliberation of a scientist, and then ate another 2 spoonfuls to clear space for the arrangement. Across the kitchen, Vivian registered the slight change in Lorenzo's posture, the fractional loosening of something that had been very tight. He was watching his daughter eat. He looked away before Mia could catch him doing it. He found Vivian in the library at 10 o'clock. She was reviewing case notes she'd made in the small notebook she'd bought in White Plains. Observations about Mia, about Elena, about the household routines and emotional temperature of the place, the kind of structured notes she'd kept on every child she'd ever treated. She didn't hide the notebook when he entered. She capped her pen and waited. "Rosa Cavallo has filed a motion to expedite," Lorenzo said. He didn't sit. He stood in front of the desk the way men stand when they're containing something. Feet planted, weight distributed, the physical grammar of a man who will not let himself pace. "The hearing has been moved up. We have 6 weeks. Vivian felt the number. 6 weeks instead of 11. 5 fewer weeks to build whatever the court needed to see. "What grounds?" "She claims new evidence of domestic instability." His jaw tightened. "She has photographs." "Of what?" "Of Elena, taken outside the school gates 3 weeks ago. Elena had... There was an incident." He stopped, restarted. "Elena was in a physical altercation with another student. The school handled it internally. I spoke with the principal. I believed it was resolved. He looked at the window. Rosa's attorney is presenting the photographs as evidence of emotional dysregulation consistent with an unstable home environment. Vivian was quiet for a moment, processing. And Elena doesn't know her grandmother's team has been photographing her outside school. No. She shouldn't find out yet. Vivian picked up her pen. What was the altercation about? The other student said something about Sophia. A pause, each word placed with careful control. About her mother. What did the student say? That's not Lorenzo. She kept her voice level, professional. I need to understand what Elena is protecting. That tells me more about where she is emotionally than 6 months of intake sessions. He looked at her. The same assessing look she'd seen on the first day, but with something different underneath it now. Not quite reluctance, but the specific resistance of a man who has not talked about any of this to anyone for a long time, and whose internal architecture has partially collapsed around the weight of not talking. The student said Sophia wasn't really worth missing, he said. That she'd heard that she died because she was weak. The room was very still. 12 years old, Vivian said. Yes. And Elena hit her. Yes. Good, Vivian said. Lorenzo blinked. It was the closest thing to surprise she'd seen on his face. Not the hitting, Vivian said. The fact that she's still fighting for her mother, that she hasn't detached, that matters. She wrote something in her notebook. It also tells me what Elena needs that she isn't getting. What does she need? Vivian looked at him steadily. Someone to tell her that her mother was worth fighting for. Someone who knew Sophia. Someone who can give her language for grief instead of leaving her to invent her own. A pause. That's you, Lorenzo. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who has just been told to do the exact thing he has spent 4 years engineering his life to avoid. That's not something I know it isn't easy. I wasn't going to say easy. His voice sharpened, the first real edge she'd heard in it. I was going to say it's not something I can do right now. We have 6 weeks and a legal motion and Elena is going to walk into that court proceeding, Vivian said, with 4 years of unaddressed grief and a suppressed rage that has nowhere to go, and Rosa Cavallo's attorney is going to be very good at drawing it out in ways that will not serve any of us. She held his gaze. I can work with Mia. I'm already working with Mia. But Elena won't let me near her on anything that matters. She needs you first. Lorenzo turned away from her. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time looking at the winter garden. The call this morning wasn't only about the hearing date, he said finally, to the window. Vivian waited. 2 of the Cavallo family's attorneys met last night with representatives from the Marchetti organization. He said it the way he'd said daughters, briefly, with the weight underneath compressed to nothing. The Marchettis have interests in 3 of the properties currently under DeMarco management. If Rosa gains legal standing as guardian of my daughters, she gains voting proxy rights over those properties under the terms of my estate arrangement. The Marchettis are aware of this. Vivian absorbed this. So this isn't a grandmother worried about her grandchildren. It has not been a grandmother worried about her grandchildren for approximately 3 months, Lorenzo said. He turned from the window. It is a coordinated acquisition attempt wrapped in family law. And you need the court to see the home environment clearly enough that the custody petition fails on its face. Yes. Then we need to move faster on Elena. Vivian closed her notebook. Arrange for me to be with her this afternoon. Not structured, not announced. Something ordinary that puts us in the same space for a few hours. Elena doesn't do ordinary things with people she doesn't trust. I know, Vivian said. So we start with the space. We work up to the trust. He looked at her for a long moment. You talk about children the way my security team talks about perimeter entry points. In some ways, it's the same problem, Vivian said. You find where the wall is thinnest. You don't try to knock it down. You wait for someone inside to open a door. Lorenzo looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read entirely, but that contained somewhere in it something that was not dismissal. Fine, he said. This afternoon. He left. Vivian sat for a moment in the library's thick quiet, then opened her notebook again and wrote, L understands strategy. Will engage if framed correctly. does not respond to vulnerability, presents it as weakness in himself, recognizes it as data in others. The grief is accessible. He just needs a reason that isn't about him. She paused. Then she wrote, Elena first, then him. That's the sequence. Elena was in the East Garden at 2 o'clock, which Mrs. Harrow mentioned while pretending to mention it to no one in particular, in the careful way she had of communicating information while maintaining plausible deniability about having communicated it. Vivian had begun to understand Mrs. Harrow, the 23 years, the loyalty, the permafrost, as a woman who cared very deeply about this family and expressed it entirely through practical action and would sooner bite through her own tongue than say so directly. Vivian put on her coat and went out. Elena was sitting on the stone bench nearest the bare rose beds with her phone, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the sky, which was the particular flat white of a December afternoon that hasn't decided yet whether to give up and snow. She heard Vivian's footsteps on the stone path and looked down immediately, phone up, as if she'd been caught doing something. Vivian walked past her. She walked to the far end of the garden and found the wooden trellis that had presumably held climbing roses in a warmer season and was now a structure of bare gray wood against the white sky. She stood there looking at it. She did not look at Elena. 30 seconds. 40. What are you doing? Elena said. Looking at the garden. There's nothing to look at. Everything's dead. Not everything, Vivian said. She crouched down, brushing frost from the base of the trellis. Look, new growth underneath the dead wood. It's dormant, not dead. The roots are still there. Silence. Then the sound of Elena getting off the bench and walking over, slowly, with the studied casualness of someone who is absolutely not interested and is approaching only to verify how uninteresting this is. Elena stood beside her and looked at the base of the trellis. That's just the root structure, Elena said. That's not the same as being alive. The root structure is the most important part, Vivian said. Everything that grows above ground depends on what's down there holding on through winter. She stood up. Your mom planted these. She said it quietly. Not a question, not an opening gambit, just a statement. Elena went very still. Mrs. Harrow told me, Vivian said, that Sophia planted the climbing roses on this trellis the first spring after the wedding, that they bloomed every June. She didn't look at Elena. She kept looking at the trellis. I thought you'd probably be the one who knows how to care for them, whether they'll come back this spring. The silence had a different quality now. Vivian could hear Elena breathing, slightly faster, the involuntary rhythm of a person whose body is responding to something before their mind can manage it. She planted them herself, Elena said. Her voice was flat, controlled. She said hired gardeners didn't understand what a garden was for. She said a garden is supposed to be about what someone loves, not what looks impressive. What did she love? Climbing roses, yellow ones, and lavender around the edges, because she said it keeps the aphids off the roses and also smells like the house she grew up in. A pause. Tight. In Tuscany. You remember that. I remember everything, Elena said. There was nothing Vivian could say to that wouldn't diminish it, so she said nothing. She stood in the gray December garden beside a 12-year-old girl who remembered everything and had no one to remember with, and she let the silence be what it was. After a long moment, Elena said, She'd hate how it looks right now. What would she want done? The dead wood needs to be cut back before February. Otherwise, the new growth next spring gets confused, comes in all wrong, grows into itself. Elena was looking at the trellis with an expression that was, for the first time since Vivian had been in this house, entirely unguarded. She showed me how to do it. The cutting back. She said it seems like you're hurting it, but actually, you're making space. Vivian looked at Elena. Elena was looking at the trellis. She was smart, Vivian said. She was the smartest person I've ever known, Elena said. And then, as if the sentence had cost her more than she'd budgeted, her jaw tightened and she took one sharp breath and the expression closed back over her face like water closing over a stone. She stepped back from the trellis. I have homework, she said. Okay, Vivian said. The pruning should happen in late January, the second or third week. Elena's voice was brisk, informational. I can show you. It wasn't an offer of friendship. It wasn't even an offer of truce. It was the most Elena could give, which was the promise of a task, a future practical obligation that would require them to be in the same place again. Vivian understood exactly what it was. Late January, she said. I'll be here. Elena walked back to the house. Vivian watched her go, the stiff, controlled walk of a girl carrying 4 years of unspent grief in her spine, and thought, door opened. 1 inch. Don't push. The confrontation she hadn't been expecting happened that evening. She heard it first, voices in the hallway outside the East Wing, which should have been quiet at 8 o'clock. Not Mia's voice, not Elena's. Adult voices, male, and Lorenzo's among them, but not in the controlled register she'd heard him use. Sharper, faster. She opened her bedroom door 6 inches. 3 men in the hallway she hadn't seen before. 2 of them wore the particular quality of clothing that people who work security wear when they're trying not to look like they work security. The third man was older, 50s, silver at the temples, heavy through the shoulders, wearing an actual suit, and he was standing closer to Lorenzo than the arrangement felt comfortable, which she suspected was intentional. The Cavallo woman isn't going to stop at the hearing, the suited man was saying. She's made contact with Rienzi. If Rienzi moves his voting block, the Marchetti deal goes sideways and you lose the Hudson properties before spring. I'm aware of what I stand to lose, Marco, Lorenzo said. Are you aware that Fabrizio Cavallo flew into Newark 2 days ago? Rosa's brother. He met with 3 people who are not lawyers. A pause. Who? We're still identifying the third. Marco glanced down the hallway, not toward Vivian's door, but in its general direction, and she went still. The arrangement you've made, the wife, is handled. Lorenzo is handled, Marco. The edge in his voice was the cleanest she'd heard it. The hearing is in 6 weeks. The domestic situation is stable. Dr. Cross is qualified and she's effective with the girls. The court will see what it needs to see. What the court sees and what's actually happening are 2 different things, Lorenzo said. I know. A pause. They've always been 2 different things. Marco looked at him for a long moment. And the woman herself, she's solid? She has no connections to anyone in our world. Her professional history is clean. Her current situation makes her highly motivated to maintain the arrangement. The words were completely flat, analytical. She's not a liability. Vivian stood very still with her hand on the inside of her door, 6 inches open, and felt those words move through her like cold water. Her current situation makes her highly motivated to maintain the arrangement, not a liability. She had known, on some functional level, that this was how Lorenzo thought about her. She had signed a contract that made the terms explicit. She had told herself, at various points over the past 4 days, that she was clear-eyed about this arrangement. Hearing it said in that voice, in that particular combination of words, to another man in the hallway of a house she had no other home to go back to. That was different from knowing it abstractly. She eased the door closed, silently. She stood in her room with her back against the door and her breath very careful and deliberate, and she thought, don't react. You are a professional. You have operated in difficult environments before. This is information, not injury. She believed approximately 60% of this. The next morning, Mia ate 6 spoonfuls of oatmeal unprompted. Vivian noted it in her book. She noted the way Mia had started gravitating toward the kitchen at mealtimes without being called, the way she'd begun commenting on things. The weather, a bird outside, a television program Mrs. Harrow watched in the evenings, small offerings of language that were the first evidence of a child beginning to test whether the world will receive her words without something going wrong. She was explaining carefully and at some length the orbital mechanics of Jupiter's moon system to Vivian when Lorenzo appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene with an expression that lasted only a second before he controlled it. But in that second, it was naked and unguarded, and it said, without language, I haven't seen her like this. He looked at Vivian over Mia's head. She looked back. She thought about the hallway, the words. Highly motivated, not a liability. She held his gaze and said nothing. He got his coffee and left, and Vivian helped Mia find a diagram of the Jovian moon system on the library computer and printed it out so Mia could use it as a reference for the raisin arrangements. And she did not mention the hallway, and she did not show him the cold place it had left. She was good at not showing things. It was, in some ways, her professional superpower and her most significant personal flaw, and she was aware of both. What she was not aware of, what none of them were aware of that morning in the kitchen, with the diagram printing and the oatmeal going cold and the winter light coming thin through the window, was that upstairs, in the room she hadn't been in yet, the room that Elena used for schoolwork, and that contained, among other things, a laptop that Elena used for things she didn't tell Mrs. Harrow about, something was already in motion. Elena had found the court documents, not the full filing, not the legal language Vivian and Lorenzo had been moving around like chess pieces, but a summary, posted in a community legal forum by someone who had no right to post it and had done so anyway, with names attached and the specific phrase unfit parental environment and a reference to new evidence filed by the petitioner. Elena was 12. She was not a child who absorbed information passively. She processed it, organized it, and drew conclusions with the speed and precision of someone who has spent 4 years paying close attention to everything around her because paying close attention was the only control available. She had concluded, from what she'd read, that her grandmother was trying to take her and Mia away from their father. She had also concluded, from a sentence she'd misread in the summary, a sentence about the hasty domestic arrangement and the question of its authentic stability, that Vivian was part of a plan that her father had constructed specifically to fool the court, that Vivian was not here because she wanted to be, that Vivian was a hired solution to a legal problem. Elena was not entirely wrong, but she was also not entirely right, and the space between those two things was where the real damage was about to happen. Vivian found out at dinner. Elena came to the table, which was itself unusual, because Elena had been taking her meals in her room with consistent frequency, and sat down and ate with the particular stillness of a person who is waiting for the right moment. Mrs. Harrow served the soup. Mia was explaining something about comet tails. Lorenzo was reading something on his phone under the table in the way people read phones under tables when they think no one can tell. "I read about the court case," Elena said. The table went quiet. Lorenzo put his phone down. "Elena," he started. "I want to talk to her," Elena said. She was looking at Vivian, not with anger. That came later. With the bright, terrible steadiness of a child who has organized her pain into a question and intends to get an answer. "Were you hired to be here?" "I signed a contract," Vivian said. "Were you hired?" "The arrangement is—" "I'm not asking about the arrangement," Elena said. Her voice was very controlled and very young at the same time, which was the most heartbreaking combination Vivian knew. "I'm asking you directly. Are you here because my father is paying you to be here? Yes or no?" The table was silent. Mia had stopped talking about comets. She was looking between Elena and Vivian with the wide, careful eyes of a child who understands that something large is happening and has learned to be very still when large things happen. Vivian looked at Elena. She could feel Lorenzo on her left, the stillness of him, the particular way he'd gone motionless, and she understood without looking that he was waiting to see what she would say, whether she would manage it smoothly, whether she would produce the right professional language to contain this. She thought about what managing it smoothly would cost Elena. "Yes," she said. Elena blinked. "Your father offered me a contract because he needed help, and I was in a situation where I needed the offer," Vivian said. "Both of those things are true. I signed it. I'm here because of it." She kept her voice level and her eyes on Elena's. "And I'm also here because I met you and your sister, and I—" "Don't," Elena said. Her voice cracked, just once, at the edge of the word. "Don't add the second part. Don't tell me you're here because you care about us. You don't know us." "You're right," Vivian said. "I don't know you yet. But what I saw in the garden yesterday, what you told me about your mother—" She paused. That wasn't part of any contract. You could have been recording it, Elena said. For the court. The accusation landed in the room like something thrown. Lorenzo said, Elena, that's enough. Don't tell me what's enough, Elena said, and turned to face her father for the first time with the full force of 14 months of not speaking to him. And the thing in her face was not anger, but something rawer and more specific, the thing that lives underneath anger in people who have loved someone and felt abandoned by them. You hired a stranger to live in our house and be our mother because a judge told you to, because Nonna Cavallo is taking us to court. Her voice was shaking now, just at the edges. Did you even think about what that— Yes, Lorenzo said. What that does to us? To Mia? Mia thinks she's— Elena stopped, pressed her mouth shut. She glanced at Mia, who was sitting with her spoon in her soup and her face very still and her eyes very bright. Elena looked at her sister and something crossed her face that was protective and exhausted and 12 years old and much older than 12 simultaneously. Mia, Elena said more quietly, can you go with Mrs. Harrow for a few minutes? Mrs. Harrow appeared in the doorway as if she'd been waiting. Which she had been, Vivian understood, because Mrs. Harrow was always waiting when the house needed her to wait. She extended her hand to Mia without comment, and Mia slid off her chair and took it, and they went. The dining room was very quiet. Elena turned back to her father. You should have told us, she said. What Nonna is doing, what the court is. You should have told us instead of just bringing someone in and— You're 12, Lorenzo said, not unkindly, but without give. I know what I am, Elena said. I also know what you are. You've been hiding in this house for 4 years. You haven't talked to me about Mom in 4 years. You didn't come to my school play. You didn't come to my— She stopped, gathered herself. You've been disappearing for 4 years, and now you need me to be normal for a judge. And you've brought in— She looked at Vivian, and then, with devastating precision, at her own father. Is she even real? As a person? Or is she just— what? A prop? Vivian was quiet. Lorenzo was quiet. The silence was the specific, terrible silence of a question that is entirely fair and has no answer that doesn't cost something. She's real, Lorenzo said finally. Elena looked at him. She's a real person who made a real choice, he said. The circumstances of that choice are complicated, but she is not a prop. He stopped. His jaw was tight. And you deserve better than what I've given you these past 4 years. That is also true. Elena stared at her father. The flatness in her eyes fractured slightly, and the fracture looked, to Vivian, like the visible evidence of the exact thing it was. A 12-year-old girl who has spent 14 months refusing to need her father, suddenly confronted with the possibility that he might be capable of acknowledging, however briefly, that she was right to be angry. It was too much to hold in a single moment. Elena pushed back from the table and walked out of the dining room with the controlled speed of someone who will not run, who will not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them run. And then her footsteps on the stairs were fast, and the sound of her bedroom door was not a slam. It was something worse, something pulled shut with deliberate restraint that was louder in what it withheld. Vivian and Lorenzo sat in the empty dining room. The soup was cold. After a long moment, Lorenzo said, "That went well." It was so unexpected, the dry edge of it, the self-awareness, that Vivian almost laughed. She stopped herself. She needed to say it, Vivian said. I know. She needed you to hear it. I know that too. He looked at the chair Elena had been sitting in. Something in his face was working. Not the controlled surface, but the thing underneath, which had been under pressure for a long time and was beginning, in small invisible ways, to show the cost. She looks like Sophia when she's angry. Vivian said nothing. Sophia was— She didn't hide things, he said, as if he was surprising himself by saying it. She thought hiding feelings was a form of disrespect. She said if you felt something strongly enough to feel it, you owed the world the honesty of showing it. He paused. I disagreed with her about that. I was wrong. Talk to her, Vivian said. Not about the court case, about Sophia. Whatever you can. I don't— I know it's hard. You keep saying that, he said. I know it's hard, as if naming the difficulty makes it. It doesn't make it easier, Vivian said. Nothing makes it easier. But Elena is holding your wife's memory entirely alone right now, and it's crushing her, and you are the only other person in this house who loves Sophia the way Elena did. She held his gaze. She doesn't need you to be fixed. She just needs to know you're in it with her. The room held that. Lorenzo looked at her for a long time, long enough that Vivian became aware of her own breathing, the table between them, the cold soup, the winter silence of the house. You're very direct, he said. I've been told. It's not a criticism. She looked back at him. I know. Something shifted, barely. The way things shift sometimes in rooms between people when a sentence lands differently than it was intended to, when the words are ordinary and what happens to them on the way across a table is not. Vivian looked down at her notebook. She didn't remember taking it out. Upstairs, a door opened, not Elena's door, Mia's. Small footsteps. Then, and this was the thing that stopped both of them, the sound of Mia's voice in the hallway, very small, saying, Elena? I'm here. And then, the sound of Elena's door opening. Vivian did not look at Lorenzo, but she heard his breath change, just barely, just once, and she understood without looking that he was hearing it too. The two girls, in the hallway above them, together. He stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, and his hands were at his sides and very still. And Vivian looked at the line of his back and thought about what Mrs. Harrow had said on Vivian's second morning in the house, passing her in the corridor with fresh linens. He used to be different. Before. That's all I'll say. She looked at her notebook. She looked at the words she'd written 3 days ago. Elena first, then him. That's the sequence. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it. An unknown number. A text message with no greeting, no name. 4 words. We should talk. Tonight. She stared at the screen. Lorenzo was still at the window. She typed back. Who is this? The reply came in 11 seconds. Someone who knows what your husband isn't telling you and what you're walking into. Meet me at the cafe on Route 9, Terrytown, 10 p.m. Come alone or I don't come at all. Vivian looked at the message. She looked at the back of Lorenzo's head. She thought about the hallway conversation, highly motivated, not a liability. She thought about what she didn't know about this family, this empire, this arrangement she'd signed her name to. She typed one word back, okay. And then she put the phone face down on the table and looked at the cold soup and the empty chairs and the notebook open in front of her, and thought about what it meant to walk into a meeting she hadn't told her husband about, in a town she barely knew, with a person she couldn't identify, on a night when the house above her was finally, quietly, beginning to breathe. She was going. She already knew she was going. The question was what she would learn when she got there, and whether the DeMarco world, which she had told herself she understood the shape of, was going to turn out to have rooms she hadn't seen yet, rooms that changed everything about the architecture she thought she'd mapped. Upstairs, Elena and Mia were together in the dark. At the window, Lorenzo had not moved, and Vivian Cross, wife on paper, professional stranger, person who was not a liability, sat at the dinner table of a mafia estate with an anonymous text on her phone and thought, something is coming. Mia had said it first. She was right. The cafe on Route 9 in Terrytown was the kind of place that existed specifically for conversations people didn't want overheard. Bad lighting, booths with high backs, a counter where the owner kept his eyes on the coffee machine and his ears pointed somewhere else. Vivian arrived at 9:52 and took a booth near the back wall, facing the door, because 11 years of working with traumatized children had taught her to always face the door. She ordered coffee she didn't intend to drink and waited. At 10:04, a woman sat down across from her. She was in her early 40s, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who has learned to dress well as a form of armor rather than vanity. Dark coat, understated jewelry, hair pulled back with a precision that suggested control was important to her. She had the kind of face that had been beautiful and was now something more interesting than beautiful, sharpened by experience into something that assessed rather than invited. She did not offer her hand. She set a leather folder on the table between them and looked at Vivian with the focused attention of someone who has rehearsed this moment and is now making adjustments for the reality of it. "Dr. Cross," she said, "thank you for coming." "I don't know who you are," Vivian said. "My name is Carla Reyes." She paused. "I'm an investigative attorney, currently retained by the Federal Organized Crime Task Force operating in the Southern District of New York." Another pause. Deliberate. Timed. "I've been building a case against the DeMarco organization for 14 months. The coffee sat untouched between them. Vivian kept her face neutral through long practice and said, "You should be talking to Lorenzo's attorneys." "I'm not here about Lorenzo," Carla Reyes said. "I'm here about you." Messe. She opened the leather folder. The first thing she placed on the table was a photograph. Vivian looked at it. It was a surveillance image, grainy, taken at distance through what appeared to be a car window, of a man she had never seen before talking to a man she recognized immediately. Gerald Rourke, DeMarco's attorney, the man who had sat across from her in the Tribeca office and walked her through the contract with 30 years of careful experience and a tone that had communicated throughout that he had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. "That photograph was taken 6 weeks before you were contacted," Carla Reyes said. "The man with Rourke is named Fabrizio Cavallo, Rosa Cavallo's brother. He has documented connections to 3 criminal organizations, 2 of which are currently in active opposition to the DeMarco family." She placed a second photograph beside the first. "This was taken 4 weeks before you were contacted." The second photograph showed Rourke again, this time with a woman Vivian didn't recognize. 50s, elegant, the particular composed expression of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room she entered. "Rosa Cavallo," Vivian said. "Yes." Vivian looked at the photographs. She felt something happening in her chest that was not quite understanding yet. It was the stage before understanding, the stage where the data is arriving faster than the framework that holds it. "Rourke has been Rosa Cavallo's attorney," Carla Reyes said, "for 11 years. He is not primarily Lorenzo DeMarco's counsel. He is retained by DeMarco on specific matters: the estate, the corporate structures, several property transactions. But his primary client relationship, his deepest institutional loyalty, is to the Cavallo family." Vivian was very still. "The custody petition," Carla Reyes continued, "was not something Rosa Cavallo decided to pursue because she was worried about her grandchildren. It was a strategy, developed over 2 years with Rourke's legal architecture, to gain proxy control of DeMarco assets through guardianship rights. But the petition alone wasn't strong enough. Rosa needed Lorenzo to respond in a specific way. She needed him to bring in a wife," Vivian said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, flat, like it was coming from a different room. "She needed him to bring in someone whose background could be investigated," Carla Reyes said. "Someone whose history contained vulnerabilities, financial exposure, professional irregularities, documented instability." She met Vivian's eyes. "Someone like you." The cafe hummed around them. The owner polished a glass behind the counter. A couple in the front booth talked about something Vivian couldn't hear. "Rourke recommended me," Vivian said. "Rourke identified you. He brought your file to Lorenzo's attention after your former partner's fraud became public record. He framed you as the ideal candidate, qualified, credentialed, desperate, isolated." Carla Reyes said the last word without apology because it was the accurate word. But the recommendation had a second function. Once you were inside the DeMarco household and the marriage was registered, Rosa's legal team would open a parallel investigation into your background, your finances, your professional history. They would build a picture of Lorenzo's judgment in choosing you, an unstable, financially compromised, professionally suspended psychologist with no established connections and no recourse, and present that picture to the court alongside the existing custody petition. "The marriage was supposed to hurt him," Vivian said. "The marriage was supposed to destroy him." Carla Reyes placed a third document on the table, a legal brief, partial, with several passages highlighted. "Rosa's attorneys filed this in the supplementary exhibits 3 days ago. It contains a full financial profile of your pre-marriage situation, every debt, the licensing suspension, Your former partner's fraud proceedings framed to suggest financial recklessness on your part rather than victimization. And an affidavit from the licensing board that characterizes your current clinical standing as, quote, insufficient to support a determination of stable professional identity. Vivian picked up the document. She read the highlighted passages. She read them once, and then she read them again because the first reading produced something in her that she needed the second reading to confirm. They had used everything. Every detail of her collapse, the practice, the money, the board investigation, had been converted into evidence against Lorenzo's fitness as a parent. His choice of her as a guardian figure was being presented as proof of desperation and poor judgment. She had walked in through a door that someone had built specifically to trap her. Rourke knew, she said. When he sat across from me and walked me through that contract, he was building the case against you at the same time, Carla Reyes said. Yes. Vivian put the document down very carefully, with the precise deliberateness of a person who is managing something that wants very badly to become a different kind of motion. And Lorenzo, she said, does not know. Carla Reyes held her gaze, which is the other reason I needed to speak with you first. You want me to tell him? I want you to understand the full picture before you do anything, Carla Reyes said, because there's more, and it changes the weight of everything. The second folder was thinner. Carla Reyes opened it and placed a single document on the table. A financial transfer record, multiple pages, with a series of account numbers that meant nothing to Vivian until Carla pointed to a specific line and said, "This account belongs to David Chen." Vivian looked at the name, David Chen. Her former partner, Lisbon. The funds your former partner took from your practice accounts, Carla Reyes said, moved through 3 intermediary accounts before landing here. She pointed to a second line. This holding company is registered in Delaware. Its beneficial owner through a chain of shell entities is Fabrizio Cavallo. The room was very quiet. David Chen didn't defraud me randomly, Vivian said. Her voice was doing the flat thing again, the distant room thing, and she let it. David Chen was approached 8 months before the fraud occurred, Carla Reyes said. He was in debt, gambling, private, the kind that doesn't appear in any public record. The Cavallo family, through Fabrizio's network, offered to clear the debt in exchange for access to your practice's client records and financial structure. The fraud was, the original plan was simply data extraction. Chen would provide documentation of your client list, your billing records, enough to assess whether you had connections to any of their existing targets. She paused. You didn't, but in the process of extracting that information, Chen developed his own secondary plan. He took the money for himself. He went to Lisbon. Fabrizio's people were displeased, but by then the damage to you was done and it served their longer-term purpose. Vivian sat with this. She sat with it the way you sit with something that reorganizes the past 14 months into a shape you didn't choose and couldn't have anticipated. And she thought about all the nights she'd spent at 2 a.m, running over the things she'd failed to see coming, the things she'd been too trusting to notice. And she thought about how it turned out she'd been right to feel that something was wrong, but the wrongness was larger and older and more deliberate than she'd understood. David Chen had not simply been greedy and careless with her life. Her life had been targeted. She had been made into a specific tool for a specific purpose by people she had never met and could not have defended against. How long have you known this? Vivian said. The Chen connection, 8 months. The Rourke connection, 4. Your placement in the DeMarco household, we understood what Rosa was doing when Rourke made the recommendation to Lorenzo. We didn't intervene. She held Vivian's gaze steadily. I'm sorry for that. You let me walk in. We needed to document the attempt, Carla Reyes said. We needed Rosa's legal team to file the supplementary exhibits, which they did 3 days ago, which is what triggered this meeting. Once those exhibits were filed, we had documented evidence of coordinated legal fraud, manufacturing vulnerability, exploiting it for a custody proceeding that was itself a vehicle for criminal asset acquisition. She leaned forward slightly. Dr. Cross, what Rosa Cavallo's team has built is a RICO-adjacent conspiracy. It touches the Chen fraud. It touches Rourke's breach of fiduciary duty, and it gives us leverage to flip Rourke as a witness against the Cavallo organization. Vivian looked at her. What do you want from me? We want you to stay in that house, Carla Reyes said. We want you to continue building your documented relationship with the children, which is real and which the court will see. We want you to give us 90 days to build the counterfiling, and we want you to tell Lorenzo DeMarco what Rourke is. You want me to be the one who tells him that his attorney of 12 years has been running a parallel operation against him inside his own estate. We want you to tell him, Carla Reyes said, because he will believe it coming from you in a way he won't believe it coming from anyone else, and because he needs to know before the hearing, not after. Vivian looked at the documents on the table, the photographs, the financial records, the legal brief that had converted her worst year into a weapon. And if I don't cooperate, she said, if I walk out of here and go home and say nothing. Carla Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then the hearing proceeds with Rosa's filing intact. Lorenzo loses the custody petition. The Cavallo family gains proxy guardianship. The DeMarco assets transfer in ways that will take years to untangle. The children go to live with a woman who is using them as leverage in a criminal acquisition. She paused. And your role in the proceeding will be reviewed as part of the court's assessment. The licensing board will receive the supplementary exhibits. Whatever slim chance you currently have of reinstatement goes away. The cup of coffee had gone completely cold. Vivian picked it up, drank some of it anyway because her mouth was dry and her hands needed something to do. I'll talk to him, she said. Carla Reyes nodded. She gathered the documents back into the folder. She left 3 specific pages on the table. The Rourke Cavallo photographs, the Chen financial transfer, the cover page of the supplementary exhibits. These are copies. Show him. She stood. Dr. Cross, for what it's worth, what you've done for those girls in less than 2 weeks, the eating, the talking, our surveillance indicates significant behavioral improvement in the younger child. She said it with a clinical precision that could not entirely conceal the fact that she had noticed. That part isn't strategy. That part is real. She left. Vivian sat in the booth for another 4 minutes, looking at the 3 pages, and then she put them in her coat pocket and walked out into the December cold and called Vincent and waited on the curb with her breath making small white shapes in the air, and thought about Gerald Rourke's face, that careful, experienced, unsurprisable face, as he'd walked her through the contract clause by clause with 30 years of practiced reassurance. She thought about what it felt like to be the last person in the room to understand the room. She thought about Elena asking, is she even real? As a person? Or is she just a prop? She had not been a prop, she had been a trap. She told him at midnight. She'd asked Mrs. Harrow, who was still awake, as Vivian was beginning to understand Mrs. Harrow was always awake when the house needed her to be, to let Lorenzo know she needed to speak with him. She waited in the library. She had the 3 documents on the desk in front of her, face down, and she had her notebook open and she had gone over what she was going to say in the car back from Terrytown and then gone over it again in the hallway, and she was as prepared as she was going to be, which felt like not very prepared at all. Lorenzo appeared in the library at 12:07 in the clothes he'd been wearing at dinner, which told her he hadn't slept either. He looked at her face and then at the documents on the desk, and he was already reading the situation before she said a word. She could see it, the way his expression shifted from the question of why she'd summoned him into something more watchful and more still. He sat down. She turned the documents over and put the Rourke Cavallo photograph in front of him. He looked at it. She watched his face. He was very good at his face. But there are things that are too large and too close to be contained in real time, and the thing that moved through Lorenzo DeMarco's expression when he understood what he was looking at was one of them. A flash of something raw and unmanaged, gone in under a second, but she saw it. Tell me where you got this, he said. His voice was completely level. She told him. She told him about the cafe, Carla Reyes, the task force. She put the Chen transfer document in front of him and told him about David and the Cavallo connection and the way her own destruction had been engineered as the first step in a strategy aimed at him. She put the supplementary exhibit's cover page down and told him what was in them. She watched him as she spoke. She watched the way his jaw set and reset. She watched his hands on the desk, flat, still, the particular stillness of a man who is converting something into something else, something more manageable, something he can use rather than feel. When she finished, he sat without speaking for a long time. 12 years, he said finally. She didn't say anything. Rourke has been in this house. He said it to the desk, not to her. At that table, with my daughters. He looked up. Who else knows? Carla Reyes and whoever she reports to in the task force. And you. And me. You went to that meeting without telling me. Yes. She held his gaze. Because I didn't know if I could trust you with what I didn't know yet. The silence had an edge. That's fair, he said. She hadn't expected that. She showed him she hadn't expected it, and he registered that she hadn't, and something in the room shifted, not toward warmth, not toward anything that could be called warmth yet, but toward a different quality of shared ground. The task force wants Rourke as a witness, she said. They want 90 days to build the counterfiling. They want the hearing to proceed with the Cavallo conspiracy documented in the federal record. And what do they want from me? Nothing specific. They want me to stay. They want the domestic situation to look exactly as it has looked. She paused. They believe the girl's well-being is legitimately served by my staying. Carla Reyes, she said what I've done for Mia is real. I don't think she meant it as leverage. I think she just said it. Lorenzo looked at the photograph of Rourke with Fabrizio Cavallo. He looked at it for a long time. The man I've trusted with my estate planning, he said, with Sophia's will, with the documentation for the girl's guardianship. His voice was controlled, precise, each word placed deliberately. He wrote the custody arrangement for my daughters after Sophia died. He sat across from me in this house and told me what the court would need and what I needed to do. He stopped. He has been building the case against me at the same time. Yes, Vivian said. He has been inside this family's most private documentation for 12 years, Lorenzo said, and working against us. Yes. And Rosa has been planning this for at least 2 years. At least. Lorenzo was quiet. Then he stood up and he walked to the window. The same window he'd stood at that afternoon when she'd told him to talk to Elena. And he stood with his back to her and his hands behind his back. And the house was quiet around them, and outside the window, the security team was moving on their rounds through the garden that Sophia had planted. My daughters, he said. Are safe, Vivian said. Right now, tonight, they're safe. If Rosa gets guardianship, she won't. Vivian said it with more certainty than she felt, because this was not the moment for calibrated uncertainty. We have 6 weeks, and we have the Cavallo conspiracy documented in federal evidence, and we have Rourke's exposure as leverage. We also have... She stopped. What? She picked up her notebook. She had been building something in it since the second day in this house, and she had not thought of it as a counter-strategy because she had thought of it as her job, which was the same thing and not the same thing. Documented evidence of significant therapeutic progress in both children. Mia's eating patterns. Elena's social engagement. Observable behavioral markers of emotional stabilization. She looked at him. 6 weeks of my notes, presented by Carla Reyes' team as independent professional evidence, will tell a different story about this household than the one Rosa's attorneys have filed. Lorenzo turned from the window. He looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the assessing look of the first day or the measuring look of the contract signing, but something else, something that was trying to figure out something about her that it hadn't figured out yet. Why? He said. Why what? Why are you still in this? He kept his voice level, but the question underneath it was not level. It was raw and direct, and he knew it, and he asked it anyway. You know now. You know you were set up. You know this arrangement was constructed to be used against me. You know your presence here is part of someone's plan to destroy this family. He stopped. Why aren't you walking out? Vivian looked at him for a moment. She thought about Mia's raisin planets. She thought about Elena standing in the dead garden saying she'd need a bigger table for Jupiter's moons. She thought about a blanket folded outside a door at 3 a.m. by a 12-year-old who would not ask for anything. Because someone in this house is going to cut the roses back in late January, she said. And I told her I'd be here. The room was very still. Lorenzo looked at her for a long time. Then his phone buzzed on the desk between them, and whatever had been in that silence was broken. And he looked at the screen, and the expression on his face changed immediately, tightened into something different, something more acute. "It's the security team," he said. He picked up the phone, read the message. Vivian watched his face. She saw it before he said it. The same thing she'd seen in the kitchen that morning when he'd taken the call about the expedited hearing, that flash of something beneath the control. The specific flash she'd come to understand meant the news was bad. "Elena left the house," he said. The clock on the library wall read 12:31. "What?" 20 minutes ago. The north gate, the security team thought she was. He was already moving toward the door, phone to his ear. "She left through the north gate with a bag. One of the team saw her, thought she was walking the perimeter with Mrs. Harrow, didn't flag it immediately." Vivian was standing. "She heard us. The library shares a wall with the staircase." Lorenzo stopped in the doorway. They looked at each other. She could have heard everything from the second step. Vivian thought about Elena at dinner, the controlled face, the question, is she even real, or is she just a prop? And then Vivian's answer, "I'm here because of the contract," and Elena had said, "Don't add the second part." Elena, who remembered everything. Elena, who processed everything at speed and drew conclusions, and then acted on them with the decisive efficiency of someone who has learned that waiting is its own form of loss. Elena, who had just overheard that her grandmother was trying to use her and her sister as leverage in a criminal takeover, that the attorney who had drawn up her mother's will was working against her father, that her father's new wife had been placed in this house as part of a trap. Elena, who had spent 14 months not speaking to her father. Elena, who was 12 years old and somewhere outside the estate on a December night in Westchester County. "Where would she go?" Vivian said. Lorenzo was already on the phone, barking coordinates to someone, but he stopped and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the control, not the calculation. Something open and frightened and completely unmanaged. "I don't know," he said. And those 3 words, in that voice, told Vivian more about what 4 years of distance had cost this man than anything he had said or not said since she'd arrived. She was already thinking. Elena, 12. Grief that lives in roses and orbital mechanics and things her mother taught her. What had she said in the garden? The cutting back seems like you're hurting it, but actually you're making space. "The cemetery," Vivian said. "Where is Sophia buried?" Lorenzo went very still. "There's a family plot," he said slowly. 20 minutes north. "That's where she went," Vivian said. She was already moving to get her coat. Lorenzo said, "Vivian." She stopped. He almost never said her name. She had noted it without noting it, the way you note things that live at the edge of awareness. "I should go alone," he said. "She doesn't want—" "She went in the middle of the night," Vivian said. "She doesn't know what she wants. She knows where to go to feel close to her mother, and she went there." She looked at him. "Go, both of us. But you talk, not me." She held his gaze. "You told me you couldn't. Tonight you can't afford not to." Something broke open in his face, briefly, cleanly, the way the surface of water breaks when something rises through it from below. "Let's go," he said. They went out into the December night together, and the cold hit Vivian's face like a hand, and the estate was lit and quiet behind them. And Mrs. Harrow was standing in the doorway with her coat over her arm, and her expression that was not quite worry, but was everything adjacent to it. And somewhere 20 minutes north, a 12-year-old girl was standing at her mother's grave in the dark, with a bag over her shoulder, and 4 years of unsaid things pressing up through her chest. And in the car, in the dark, driving north on roads that were empty at this hour, Lorenzo DeMarco sat beside Vivian with his hands on his knees and said, without preamble, without looking at her, "Sophia died because the pregnancy was too much. We knew the risks. The doctors told us. She wanted another child. She wanted a son, not for the reasons people assume, not for the inheritance. She wanted him. She'd already named him." He stopped. "I let her proceed. I could have said no. I had influence over her decisions, and I chose not to use it because I told myself it was her choice and she had the right to it. And the truth is, I was afraid of what she'd think of me if I tried to take that choice away. He looked at the road. She died holding my hand. She looked at me at the end, and she wasn't afraid. She was angry. She was angry that she was leaving. His voice was steady and quiet and completely wrecked underneath the steadiness. I have not been able to look at my daughters for 4 years without seeing that anger, without knowing that they got less of her because she was trying to give me something I'd asked for, because I hadn't said no when I should have. The road went past dark fields and bare trees and the occasional light of a house that had nothing to do with any of them. She wasn't angry at you, Vivian said. You didn't know her. No, Vivian said, but Elena knows her. And Elena is at that grave right now, and she hasn't stopped fighting for her mother's memory for 4 years. She looked at him. That's not what children do when their mothers die angry. That's what children do when they knew, completely and without question, that they were loved. Lorenzo said nothing. The car moved through the dark, and then, very quietly, he said, "She'd have liked you." Vivian looked at the road. "Sophia," he said, "she'd have liked the way you—" She had no patience for people who softened things to be kind. She said the kindest thing you could do for someone was tell them the true thing even when it cost you. He paused. She would have liked you. The cemetery gates were ahead. The headlights swept across old stone and winter grass and the bare arms of trees, and there, at the far end of a path between graves, small and dark against the pale stone, was Elena. She hadn't heard the car yet. She was standing with her back to them, her bag at her feet, her shoulders pulled in against the cold, and she was talking. Not loud enough to hear, just moving her lips, her face turned down toward the grave marker, having a conversation she'd needed to have for 4 years in the only place she could figure out how to have it. Lorenzo got out of the car. He stood for a moment in the cold looking at his daughter's back. Vivian stayed in the car. This was not hers. This was the thing that needed to happen without her, the specific conversation between a father and his daughter and the ghost of the woman between them. And she understood her role here with the clarity she always had about where to be and when to be absent. She watched through the windshield as Lorenzo walked toward Elena. She watched Elena's shoulders go rigid when she heard his footsteps, watched her turn, defensive, braced, the face she made when she was about to fight. She watched Lorenzo stop 3 feet away from his daughter and say something she couldn't hear. And then she watched Elena's face do something it had not done in any of the 4 days Vivian had been in that house. It broke. Not the controlled fracture she'd seen at the dinner table, not the careful edge. It broke the way things break when they have been held too long against a force that was always going to win, completely, all at once, the whole structure giving way. And Elena DeMarco, 12 years old, who had not been held by her father in 14 months, took 2 steps and ran the last one, and Lorenzo caught her and held on. Vivian looked at the road ahead of the car. She gave them their privacy. She sat in the dark with her hands in her lap and the cold pressing against the windows, and she thought about Sophia DeMarco, whom she had never known, who had planted yellow climbing roses because the hired gardeners didn't understand what a garden was for. She thought about what it cost a person to love something that much, to love it knowing the cost. She thought about the text message from Carla Reyes that had arrived at 11:47, just before she'd sent Mrs. Harrow for Lorenzo. The message she had not included in what she'd told him because the moment hadn't been right, and then the evening had become other things. The message that said, "One more thing." The supplementary exhibits Rosa's team filed. They contain a medical subpoena. DeMarco's family physician, Dr. Emil Voss. He's been ordered to provide Elena's complete medical history. All of it, including records from 14 months ago that were sealed under minors' privacy protections. Rosa's team is challenging the seal on grounds that the records are relevant to the fitness determination. The judge has 48 hours to rule on the challenge. And then, if the seal breaks, you need to know what's in those records. Voss will tell DeMarco if you ask him to. Ask him tonight. Vivian had not asked Voss tonight. She had not had time. She had the message in her pocket and a growing understanding of something she could feel the shape of without yet being able to name. A piece of information about Elena that was sealed and that Rosa Cavallo was trying to unseal, and that Dr. Voss knew and that Lorenzo apparently did not know or had not connected to the current situation. 14 months ago. 14 months ago was when Elena had stopped speaking to her father. 14 months ago was also, Vivian calculated in the cold of the car, with the windshield beginning to fog, approximately when Mia's eating had first become a significant concern. 14 months ago, something had happened to Elena that was in sealed medical records and that Rosa Cavallo believed was damaging enough to Lorenzo's case that it was worth a legal challenge to unseal them. And whatever it was, Vivian was going to find out in the next 48 hours whether she asked or not, because a judge was about to decide whether the seal held. Outside the car, Lorenzo was still holding his daughter. Elena's shoulders were shaking. The grave marker was white in the dark, and the winter grass was silver with frost, and Vivian Cross sat in a car in a cemetery in Westchester County at 1 a.m. and thought, "This family is not finished breaking yet." She thought, "Whatever is in those records is going to change everything." "I think I understand about what happened in this house." She thought, "I need to talk to Voss before dawn." And underneath all of it, deeper than strategy and deeper than professional assessment, she thought about what Lorenzo had said in the car. She'd have liked you. And the way it had landed somewhere she hadn't expected and had not yet figured out what to do with. The windows were fully fogged now. She reached up and cleared a circle with her sleeve and looked out at the dark cemetery and at Lorenzo DeMarco holding his daughter at his wife's grave, and she thought, 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and Rourke still sitting in his Tribeca office thinking he'd built an airtight trap. 6 weeks, and Rosa Cavallo still certain she'd won. 6 weeks, and somewhere in a sealed file was a piece of this family's story that was about to be forced into the light, whether any of them were ready for it. Vivian put her hand on the door handle. She had to call Voss. She had to know what was in those records before the morning, before the judge ruled, before whatever was in that file became the next thing this family had to survive without being prepared for it. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold, and the night air hit her face. And across the cemetery, Lorenzo looked up and met her eyes over Elena's head. And what was in his expression was not the control and not the calculation and not the careful management of a man who has spent 12 years running an empire on the principle that showing nothing is the same as being safe. What was in his expression was something much simpler and much more dangerous than any of that. It was trust. Vivian looked back at him for 1 second in the cold and the dark. Then she took out her phone and called Dr. Emil Voss. Dr. Emil Voss answered on the 3rd ring. He sounded awake, which told Vivian he'd been expecting the call. Not from her specifically, but from someone. Because men who carry the kind of information Voss was carrying don't sleep easily when that information is in motion. "Dr. Cross," he said. "I need to know what's in Elena's sealed records," she said. She was standing in the cemetery in the dark, 20 feet from where Lorenzo and Elena were still together at Sophia's grave, and she kept her voice low and her back turned and her eyes on the frost-pale grass at her feet. "The judge rules on Rosa's unsealing challenge in 48 hours. I need to know before the ruling." A long pause, long enough that she heard him exhale, a careful breath, the breath of a man deciding something. "Come to the clinic," he said. "Now, I'll be there." She told Lorenzo in the car on the way back. Elena was asleep in the back seat within minutes of leaving the cemetery, the specific collapsed sleep of a child who has spent everything they had and has nothing left to hold themselves upright with. Lorenzo drove. Vivian sat in the passenger seat and told him about Carlo Reyes's second message, about the sealed records, about Voss. He listened without interrupting. His hands stayed at 10 and 2 on the wheel. "What do you think is in them?" he said, when she finished. "I don't know," she said. "But Rosa believes they hurt you, which means they contain something about Elena that Rosa thinks reflects on the home environment." She paused. 14 months ago. He was quiet for a moment. 14 months ago, Elena stopped speaking to me, he said. "I know. Before that, she was difficult, grieving, angry at everything. But she talked, she fought, she had—" He stopped. "There was an incident at school. different from the one Rosa's team photographed. Earlier, she hurt herself. Vivian went still. Not seriously, Lorenzo said, the words coming out with the particular difficulty of words that have been avoided for a long time. A teacher found marks on her arm. The school called me. I took her to Voss. He referred her to a therapist. He looked at the road. The therapist said Elena needed me to be more present. I increased the security around her. I hired additional staff. I thought presence meant... He stopped again. I didn't understand what she needed. I provided what I knew how to provide. Vivian looked at the road. And she stopped speaking to you after that. After the therapist visit, yes. Because you hired more staff instead of spending more time with her. Yes? Lorenzo. She kept her voice level. Those records contain a clinical assessment of Elena's self-harm incident and the therapeutic recommendation that followed. If Rosa unseals them and presents them to the court without context, they will show a child hurting herself in a household with an absent father and an increasing security apparatus and no consistent maternal presence. She looked at him. Rosa's attorney will frame it as evidence of a child in crisis inside an unfit home. And with context? With context, they show a child experiencing acute grief after losing her mother, receiving appropriate clinical intervention, making documented progress in a stable therapeutic environment. She paused. My notes from the past 12 days are that context. And tonight, what happened tonight at the cemetery, that is also context. Lorenzo pulled into the estate gates. In the back seat, Elena slept with her cheek against the window, her face unguarded in the way faces are unguarded only in sleep and in grief that has been fully spent. She talked to me, Lorenzo said, very quietly. At the grave, she talked to me about Sophia. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The quality of his voice said everything about what those 20 minutes in the cold had cost and what they had returned. I know, Vivian said. She asked me if I blamed myself. He paused. I told her the truth. Good. He stopped the car. He turned to look at her, and in the light from the estate entrance, his face was tired in a way that was different from the controlled exhaustion she'd been reading for 12 days. This was something that had come through something, the specific tiredness of a person on the other side of a necessary ordeal. Go to Voss, he said. Find out everything. The DeMarco family clinic was a private medical facility on the estate grounds, a fact that had not been in anything Vivian had read about the family, and that she filed away as another detail in the map of how this world sustained itself. Voss met her at the door at 2:15 in the morning, a slight man in his 60s with careful eyes, and the manner of someone who has maintained professional composure through things that would have destroyed most people's capacity for it. He didn't offer pleasantries. He led her to his office and put a physical file on the desk between them. Paper, not digital, the kind of record that exists in one place only. What I'm going to tell you, he said, I'm telling you because I believe it serves Elena's best interest. Not because I'm legally required to. Not because the task force or anyone else is compelling me. He looked at her. Do you understand the distinction? Yes, she said. He opened the file. She drove back to the main house at 3:40 in the morning with the file contents in her head, organized and terrible, and she sat in the estate driveway for 4 minutes before going inside because she needed those 4 minutes to convert what she'd learned into something she could carry without it showing on her face. Elena, 14 months ago, had not only hurt herself. She had taken 14 of Mrs. Harrow's sleeping pills from the upstairs medicine cabinet at 2 in the morning and been found 40 minutes later by Mrs. Harrow herself, who had been doing a routine check of the house and had found Elena in the bathroom floor. Voss had been called before the ambulance, which was how the incident had been managed within the family's private network, rather than through a hospital system that would have generated a public record. Elena had survived without lasting physical harm. Voss had assessed her over the following weeks. He had filed the incident under a clinical classification that allowed the records to be sealed under minor privacy law. He had recommended intensive therapeutic intervention and strongly advised Lorenzo's consistent presence. Lorenzo had not been told the full specifics of what Elena had taken or how many. He had been told self-harm incident, which was accurate and which was also a category that contained, at one end, marks on an arm, and at the other end what had actually happened. Voss had made a judgment call about what Lorenzo could absorb at the time. A judgment call that Rosa Cavallo's attorneys had somehow obtained sufficient information about to file the unsealing challenge. Someone had told them. Not the full record. They couldn't have the full record. It was sealed and in Voss's physical possession. But enough. Enough to know that something more significant than marks on an arm was in that file. Vivian sat in the driveway and thought about who in this household had access to the information that a sealed medical incident existed and that it was more serious than its public classification suggested. The list was short. Mrs. Harrow, Voss, Lorenzo, partially. The therapist Voss had referred Elena to, a woman named Dr. Patricia Shen, who had seen Elena for 3 sessions before Elena refused to continue attending. She thought about Rourke, who had been Lorenzo's attorney for 12 years, who had handled the estate documentation, who had likely handled the legal framing of the incident when it came to the school, because schools required documentation, required the liability to be managed, required someone with legal expertise to ensure the right boxes were checked and the right language was used. Rourke would have known there was a sealed incident. He would not have known the full contents, but he would have known enough to point Rosa's team toward the right challenge. She went inside. Check. She found Mrs. Harrow in the kitchen at 4 in the morning making tea, which seemed, by this point in Vivian's experience of the household, like simply what Mrs. Harrow did instead of sleeping. Vivian sat down. Rourke knew about the sealed file, she said. Not a question. Mrs. Harrow set down her cup. She turned from the stove and looked at Vivian with an expression that was the most unguarded Vivian had seen on her face. Not warm, not soft, but stripped of the institutional distance, just a woman who had worked in this house for 23 years and had loved the people in it with a ferocity she expressed entirely through competence and constancy. He handled the school documentation, Mrs. Harrow said. Yes. How much did he know? He knew there was a sealed clinical incident. He knew it was serious. He asked me once, 6 months ago, whether Elena had fully recovered. Mrs. Harrow's jaw tightened. I told him that was not a question I would answer. But he had enough to brief Rosa's team. He had enough, Mrs. Harrow said, to point them at the right door. She looked at Vivian steadily. What are you going to do with it? I need to get ahead of the unsealing, Vivian said. If that file opens in a courtroom without framing, without context, without Elena's recovery being documented, it ends the custody case before we have a chance to present the counterfiling. So control the opening, Mrs. Harrow said. Vivian looked at her. You've been here 12 days, Mrs. Harrow said. You've done more for those girls in 12 days than… She stopped herself. The discipline of 23 years pulled the sentence back. What do you need? I need Lorenzo to authorize Voss to provide a full voluntary disclosure to the court before Rosa's unsealing motion is ruled on. She looked at Mrs. Harrow. Voluntary disclosure reframes everything. It shows a father who is not hiding his family's struggles, but who is actively and transparently addressing them. It turns the sealed file from a weapon into evidence of appropriate intervention. And Lorenzo has to be the one to authorize it. Lorenzo has to be the one to authorize it, Vivian said, and he has to know the full contents first, the parts Voss didn't tell him 14 months ago. The kitchen was quiet. Mrs. Harrow poured a second cup of tea and put it in front of Vivian without asking. He's in the study, Mrs. Harrow said. He hasn't slept. She told him everything at 4:20 in the morning. She sat across the desk from him and told him what Voss had told her, and she watched his face while she did it, and she did not look away because he deserved not to be alone in the room when this information arrived. He did not move. He sat very still, and he listened to every word, and when she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she counted her own heartbeats, 7, 8, 9, before he spoke. She almost died, he said. Yes. He put his hands flat on the desk. He looked at them. And Voss told me self-harm incident. He made a judgment about what you could receive at the time. She paused. I'm not defending the decision. I'm telling you why it was made. 14 months ago, he said. 14 months ago, I hired more security. His voice was completely controlled, which was, she understood now, not composure, but its exact opposite. The maximum effort of a man holding something in that wants to be something else entirely. I provided what I knew how to provide. Yes. And she stopped speaking to me. She didn't blame you for your wife's death, Vivian said. She blamed you for not seeing her. The sentence landed in the room. Lorenzo looked up at her. She needed you to see her, Vivian said, and you hired more staff. And she understood, the way children understand these things, in their bones before their minds can frame it, that you are not going to see her. Not then. Maybe not ever. She held his gaze. So she stopped trying to be seen. His hands on the desk were pressed very flat and very still. Tonight at the cemetery, Vivian said, she saw you. For the first time in 14 months, she saw you there, present, without armor. She paused. That's what went into that grave with her tonight. The waiting, the question of whether you were ever going to come. Lorenzo stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. The estate was dark except for the security lights. The dead garden was pale with frost. Authorize the disclosure, Vivian said. Let me build the context around it. My notes, Voss's clinical record of Elena's recovery, the documentation from the past 12 days. She stood. We have 36 hours before the judge rules. If we file voluntary disclosure with complete clinical context before the ruling, we take the weapon out of Rosa's hand and give it back to you as evidence. And if the court sees the full record regardless, the full record shows a child who survived a crisis, received appropriate intervention, and is demonstrably recovering in a household that is now providing what she needs. She kept her voice steady. The record doesn't hurt you, Lorenzo. Rosa wanted to use it to hurt you. That's different. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he said, Call Rourke. Tell him I need a meeting at 9 a.m. Vivian paused. You want me to call Rourke? I want him in a room where I can look at him when I tell him he's no longer my attorney. Something in his voice was very quiet and very final. And then I want him to understand, with complete clarity, what happens when someone betrays this family. Lorenzo. I'm not going to touch him, he said, without turning from the window. I want him to understand that I know. I want him to sit in that room knowing that I know, and knowing that he has nowhere to go. Because what he's done constitutes enough legal exposure to destroy him professionally and criminally. He paused. I want him to make a choice in that room about whether he prefers to be Carlo Reyes's witness or my enemy. Those are his two options. Vivian looked at his back. That's what I was going to suggest, she said. He turned from the window. Go sleep, he said. 2 hours at least. I need you functional. And you? I'm going to sit with this for a while, he said. She understood. Some things require the night. She left him there. What? The meeting with Rourke happened at 9:03. Lorenzo had called him, not Vivian, and whatever he'd said on the phone had been enough to bring Rourke to the estate without preparation. He arrived in his car without his usual assistant, without the leather briefcase, which told Vivian that whatever Lorenzo had said had made the briefcase feel beside the point. Rourke walked into the library and saw the Cavallo photographs on the desk. He stopped. His face did not collapse. He was too experienced for that. But something evacuated it. The 30 years of careful composure thinning from underneath, leaving the surface intact and the interior suddenly, visibly hollow. Lorenzo was standing. He did not gesture to a chair. Sit down, he said. Rourke sat. You met with Fabrizio Cavallo 6 weeks before you recommended Dr. Cross to me, Lorenzo said. His voice was the quietest she'd heard it and the most dangerous. You have been the primary architect of the legal structure Rosa Cavallo is using to take my children. He placed the photographs one at a time on the desk, slowly, with precise intervals. You used 12 years of my family's documentation to build a case against me while cashing my retainer. Rourke opened his mouth. Don't, Lorenzo said. Rourke closed it. You have two choices, Lorenzo said. You provide full cooperation to the federal task force currently investigating the Cavallo network. You disclose the complete legal strategy you built for Rosa, and you withdraw from any further involvement in the custody proceeding. In exchange, what you've done to this family stays out of channels that would end your career and your freedom in ways that would last the rest of your life. He paused. Or you leave this room without cooperating, and I make one call. The library was absolutely silent. Rourke looked at the photographs. He looked at Lorenzo. He looked, briefly, at Vivian. And in that look was something she hadn't expected. Not calculation, not the man who'd built the trap, but the specific expression of someone who had been moving in a direction for a long time and had not fully reckoned with where that direction ended until they arrived at the end of it. "The task force already has enough without me," Rourke said. His voice was very careful. "Yes," Lorenzo said, "but they'd prefer the testimony, and so would I." A long pause. Rourke's hands were on the arms of the chair, and his posture was immaculate and controlled, and it cost him something visible to maintain it. "The hearing is in 6 weeks," Rourke said. 5, Lorenzo said. It was expedited. "If I withdraw from Rosa's legal team now, she'll know immediately." "I don't care what Rosa knows," Lorenzo said. "I care what you decide, right now, in this room." Vivian watched Rourke. She watched the 30 years of professional composure doing the thing it was built to do, which was make decisions under pressure without showing the pressure, and she watched it arrive at a decision. "I'll cooperate," Rourke said. "With everything," Lorenzo said. "With everything." "Call Reyes's office when you leave here," Vivian said. "I'll give you the number." Rourke looked at her for a moment. The look of a man who had studied her file, who had selected her for her vulnerabilities, who was now sitting across from her in a room where she had just watched him fold. He said nothing. He left. Woke. The next 72 hours moved at a speed that Vivian experienced not as time, but as a series of consecutive crises requiring consecutive decisions, each one harder than the last, each one with less margin. Carla Reyes's team received Rourke's disclosure and began the counterfiling. Voss prepared the voluntary disclosure package with Vivian's clinical notes attached. Lorenzo authorized it at 2 in the afternoon, and the filing was submitted to the court by 4, which was 12 hours before the judge was scheduled to rule on Rosa's unsealing challenge. The judge, presented with a voluntary disclosure that rendered the unsealing motion moot, declined to rule. Rosa's attorneys called Lorenzo's new counsel, a firm Carla Reyes' office had quietly recommended, 2 senior litigators who specialized in exactly this kind of intersection between family law and organized crime, and filed 3 new objections before midnight. And then, at 11:20 the following morning, 4 days before the hearing, Elena collapsed. She was in the upstairs hallway. Mrs. Harrow heard the sound and was there first, which was Mrs. Harrow. Always there first, always the one who got there in time. And for once, she'd arrived too late to prevent something because Elena was already on the floor by the time Mrs. Harrow reached her, conscious but barely, her color wrong, her breathing too shallow, her hands at her chest in the particular position of someone responding to pain they cannot locate. Vivian reached her 40 seconds after Mrs. Harrow. She did not hesitate. She checked pulse, fast, irregular, the rhythm wrong in a way that was not anxiety and not panic, but something physical and acute. She looked at Elena's coloring, at her lips, at the sweat on her face that had appeared too quickly in air that was not warm. "Voss," she said to Mrs. Harrow. "Now." Mrs. Harrow was already on the phone. Vivian stayed on the floor beside Elena, tracking the pulse under her fingers, watching the breathing, talking to her in the low, even voice she used when a child was frightened and needed an anchor. Not reassurances, because reassurances she couldn't deliver weren't kindness, but presence, the sound of a voice, the specific communication of, "I am here, I see you, I am not leaving." "It hurts," Elena said. Her voice was thin. "I know. Where?" "Chest." A pause. A small sound. "And my arm." Vivian tightened her grip on Elena's wrist without showing the tightening. Left arm pain, chest, irregular pulse in a 12-year-old who had no known cardiac history. "Lorenzo," she said, without raising her voice. She didn't need to raise it. He was already in the hallway. She'd heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the change in their rhythm when he saw his daughter on the floor. He was beside her in 2 seconds. He went to his knees. Elena looked at her father and said, with the particular precision of a child who is frightened and trying not to show it, "I don't feel right." "I know," Lorenzo said. His voice did not shake. Voss is coming. You're going to be okay. He looked at Vivian over his daughter's head, and his eyes asked the question he couldn't ask in front of Elena. Vivian held his gaze and gave him nothing she wasn't sure of, which was, right now, very little. Voss arrived in 4 minutes. He assessed Elena in the hallway and made 2 phone calls, and by the time he finished the second call, his face had the particular quality of a doctor who has identified something that requires more than he has here. Cardiac arrhythmia, he said to Lorenzo quietly, away from Elena. Possibly structural, possibly inflammatory. There's a presentation consistent with myocarditis, though I can't confirm without imaging. He kept his voice low and precise. She needs the cardiac unit at Meridian, today. Lorenzo looked at him. The Meridian facility. The facility is equipped. The team is on standby. Voss paused. Lorenzo. She needs to go now. In the hallway, Vivian was sitting beside Elena, who had her eyes closed and her breathing shallow, and her hand in Vivian's with the loose grip she used in sleep, the grip of someone who holds on without asking, who needs but will not name the need. Vivian looked at Elena's face. She had been looking at this face for less than 2 weeks, and she knew it now in the specific way she came to know the faces of children she worked with. The language of it. What it looked like when it was hiding, and what it looked like when it was spent. Right now it looked very young and very pale, and very much like a child who had been carrying too much for too long, and whose body had finally presented the bill. Lorenzo crouched beside his daughter. Hey, he said. Elena opened her eyes. We're going to the clinic, he said. Voss is going to look at your heart. Is it bad? Elena said. Lorenzo looked at his daughter for one long moment, and Vivian watched him decide, not calculate, not manage, but genuinely decide. To do the thing he'd spent 4 years not doing. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm not leaving you, whatever it is. Elena looked at him. Something moved through her face, the last residue of 14 months of a question she'd been waiting to have answered. Okay, she said. They moved fast after that. Lorenzo carried Elena to the car over her objection that she could walk, an objection she made once and quietly and then abandoned. And Vivian sat beside her in the back seat with Elena's hand still in hers and monitored her breathing the 15-minute drive to the facility and did not let herself think about what myocarditis in a 12-year-old looked like because she knew what it looked like, and thinking about it clearly right now would not help anyone in this car. The Meridian Cardiac Facility was private and very clean and had the particular hush of medical spaces where the stakes are high and the staff has learned to communicate that they are managing them without communicating that they are afraid of them. They took Elena immediately. Lorenzo went with her. Vivian was left in the waiting room. She sat in a chair and looked at the wall, and her hands were in her lap, and she was aware, with the clarity that arrives when adrenaline has been burning for long enough that it starts to feel like stillness, that she had not eaten since the oatmeal she'd made Mia at breakfast, that it was now 3:15 in the afternoon, that she had slept a total of 4 hours in the past 40 hours. She called Mrs. Harrow. Mia was fine. She'd been in the library with a book when Elena collapsed and hadn't seen it, and Mrs. Harrow had managed the information carefully. Vivian told her where they were. She told her to tell Mia that Elena was getting checked out and was okay, and that Vivian would call again soon. Is she okay? Mrs. Harrow said. Vivian looked at the wall. I don't know yet, she said. Keep Mia busy. She hung up. She sat. At 4:07, Lorenzo came out through the double doors. She stood. His face was controlled. She had learned to read what was under his control, and what she read now was something at the edge of what he could hold. Voss's assessment was correct, he said. Myocarditis. Viral inflammatory. They believe it developed over the past several weeks, possibly triggered by physical and emotional stress. He stopped. Restarted. It has progressed further than they expected. The inflammation is affecting conduction. She's had a significant arrhythmic event, and they believe there will be more if they don't intervene. What are they recommending? There's a treatment protocol, experimental, not approved through standard channels yet, but the Meridian team has been working with it for 2 years. Targeted anti-inflammatory combined with arrhythmia suppression. He looked at her. The family physician here, Dr. Kwan, is recommending we attempt it. She says the standard treatment course for this presentation has a low efficacy rate for Elena's specific markers. And the experimental protocol? Significant response rate in the trials Kwan has conducted, but he stopped again. The word but was sitting in front of something he hadn't said yet and couldn't say lightly. It carries risk. If Elena's system doesn't respond to the first phase in the window they need, they'll be in a position of having bypassed the standard treatment without time to return to it. Vivian looked at him. What does Kwan recommend? She said. She recommends the protocol, Lorenzo said. She says Elena's presentation is exactly the profile the trial was designed for. He looked at his hands. She says the standard treatment will likely slow the progression but probably won't reverse it. The protocol might. He met Vivian's eyes. She says might. The waiting room was very quiet. A television on the wall showed a news channel with the sound off. What does your instinct say? Vivian said. My instinct says. He stopped. His jaw tightened. My instinct failed this child for 14 months. I don't trust my instinct. Lorenzo. She kept her gaze on his. Tonight at the cemetery you made the right call. You went. You stayed. You told her the truth. She paused. That was your instinct. Trust it. He looked at her for a long moment. The protocol, he said. I'm authorizing the protocol. Then go back in there with her, Vivian said. She needs you in the room. He turned back toward the double doors. He stopped with his hand on the push bar. Vivian, he said without turning. She waited. When this is over, he said, I need to talk to you about something that isn't the case, and isn't the girls, and isn't any of this. The waiting room was quiet around them. Okay, she said. He pushed through the doors. Vivian sat back down. She sat in the chair and looked at the wall and thought about a 12-year-old girl on the other side of those doors with her father beside her and an experimental treatment beginning its first phase. And she thought about what Dr. Kwan's efficacy rate actually meant when you translated it from clinical language into the language of a child's heartbeat. And she thought about the hearing in 5 days, and Rosa Cavallo, and the counterfiling, and Rourke's disclosure, and all the machinery of this battle that had not stopped because Elena had collapsed. None of it had stopped. Rosa's attorneys had filed 2 more motions that afternoon while Vivian was driving to the cemetery, which she'd read on her phone in the waiting room and had not yet processed. The hearing date was fixed. The counterfiling was submitted. The evidence was assembled. Everything they had built in 12 days of sustained pressure was in position. And Vivian Cross was sitting in a cardiac waiting room in Westchester County at 4:20 in the afternoon with 4 hours of sleep and no food, and a 12-year-old on the other side of 2 doors whose heart was fighting to stabilize, and the hearing was in 5 days, and she could not be in 2 places at once. She looked at her phone. She called Carla Reyes. Elena DeMarco has been admitted to the Meridian Cardiac Facility, she said when Reyes picked up. Myocarditis with arrhythmic events. They're beginning the experimental protocol tonight. Silence on the line. Then, how serious? Serious enough that Dr. Lorenzo DeMarco has just authorized an experimental treatment protocol rather than standard care. A pause. What do you need from me? I need to know if the hearing can be moved, Vivian said, or if we can request a continuance based on medical emergency. Rosa's team will oppose any continuance, Reyes said. They'll argue it's a delay tactic. Then oppose the opposition, Vivian said. You have enough on the Cavallo network to make opposing a sick child's continuance request look like exactly what it is. A pause. Give me an hour. Vivian hung up. She sat. At 6:43, Lorenzo came back through the double doors. She stood again. She read his face. First phase is complete, he said. They're monitoring her response for the next 6 hours. He stopped. Dr. Kwan says it looks promising. She says Elena's rhythm has already started to stabilize. Vivian let out a breath. She's asking for you, Lorenzo said. Vivian looked at him. She asked for you by name, he said. She said... He stopped. Something moved through his face that was too large and too close to be entirely managed. She said, tell Vivian I want to know what happens to the roses. The waiting room was very quiet. Vivian picked up her coat and her bag. She looked at Lorenzo DeMarco, who was standing in the middle of a cardiac waiting room at 6:43 in the evening, looking at her with an expression that had nothing of the controlled surface in it. Just the man underneath, exhausted and present, and somewhere in the architecture of his face, something that had been closed for 4 years that was not entirely closed anymore. "I'll go in," she said. She pushed through the double doors. Elena was in a bed with monitors beside her and the particular pale precision of a child who has been through something and is on the other side of the worst of it, still tired, still fragile, but present and awake and holding a cup of water with both hands. She looked at Vivian when she came in. "They told my dad to eat something," Elena said. "He won't." "I know," Vivian said. "He's stubborn. You should make him." "I'll try." Elena looked at her. The flatness was gone, not replaced by warmth exactly, but by something that was the beginning of what warmth grows from. "Are you scared?" she said. Vivian pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat in it. "Yes," she said. Elena looked at this for a moment, then she nodded once, like someone confirming a calculation. "Me too," she said. Vivian leaned forward and put her hand on the bed beside Elena's, not taking it, just placing it there at the right distance, the way she'd sat beside Mia in the dark on the first night. Close enough to be real, not close enough to overwhelm. Elena looked at her hand, then she moved her own hand an inch and put it on top of Vivian's. Outside the room, through the small window in the door, Vivian could see Lorenzo in the corridor, not sitting, not pacing, but standing very still with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, and the look on his face was not composure and not management, and not the controlled surface of a man who has built his survival on showing nothing. It was a man waiting for what comes next. 5 days to the hearing. The counterfiling was in. Rourke had folded. The experimental protocol was underway. The machinery was in motion. And Rosa Cavallo, who had spent 2 years building a trap, who had used Vivian's worst year as a weapon, who had tried to take these children as pieces in a criminal acquisition, Rosa Cavallo did not yet know that everything she'd built was already coming apart at its seams. She was going to find out in a courtroom in 5 days. She was going to find out because Vivian Cross, who had arrived at this house 12 days ago with a cardboard box and a dying rose and $212, was going to be standing in that courtroom with every document, every clinical note, every piece of evidence she had built in the space between one family's grief and her own. And she was going to dismantle Rosa Cavallo's conspiracy in front of a judge who was going to understand, before the morning session was finished, that what had been presented as a grandmother's concern was a criminal acquisition dressed in family law clothing. Elena's hand was warm in hers. The monitors beeped in their steady, measured rhythm. And on the other side of the door, Lorenzo DeMarco opened his eyes, pushed off the wall, and walked toward the window at the end of the corridor that looked out at the December dark. And Vivian could see, in the set of his shoulders and the particular way he stood, that something had shifted in him between the cemetery and this corridor, between the girl who had stopped speaking to him and the girl who had asked for Vivian by name and told her father to eat something. Something had come back online that had been dark for 4 years, and Vivian thought, looking at him through the window in the door, with Elena's pulse steady under her fingers and the monitors marking time, the hearing is in 5 days. Elena came home on a Tuesday. She walked through the front door of the estate under her own power, which she had insisted on with the particular quiet stubbornness that Vivian had come to understand as Elena's most essential quality. The refusal to be carried when she could stand, the refusal to accept less than what she believed she could manage. Dr. Kwan had discharged her with a monitoring protocol, a medication schedule, and the specific instruction that emotional stability was as critical to her recovery as the pharmaceutical intervention. She'd said it looking at Lorenzo, and Lorenzo had nodded in the way he nodded when he was taking something seriously enough that words felt insufficient. Mrs. Harrow had made soup. Mia had constructed a welcome home arrangement on the kitchen table out of dried rose hips and the last of the winter lavender from the estate's small greenhouse, which she presented to Elena with the gravity of a scientist presenting peer-reviewed findings. Elena looked at the arrangement for a moment. Then she pulled her sister into her arms and held on. Vivian stood in the kitchen doorway and watched and did not go in. Some things needed to happen in the space that belonged to them, without witnesses who were still learning what they were witnessing. The hearing was in 3 days. Vivian spent those 3 days the way she'd spent the past 2 weeks, in the space between what needed to be done and what it cost to do it, moving from task to task with the particular focused economy of someone who has burned through their reserve of self-protection and is operating on something older and more durable underneath. She reviewed the counterfiling with Lorenzo's new attorneys, Marcus Webb and Diana Chu, two people who worked with the efficient precision of surgeons and who had, in the 5 days since their engagement, assembled a legal counter-argument that Vivian found genuinely impressive. She reviewed her own clinical notes, refined the documentation of Elena and Mia's behavioral progress, and prepared a supplementary declaration that laid out, in the measured language of her profession, what she had observed and what it meant. She sat with Elena in the library for 2 hours on the second day, not doing therapy. Elena had made her feelings about formal therapy clear enough, but talking, the way they'd talked in the garden about the roses, with the sideways approach that Elena tolerated better than directness. They talked about myocarditis, which Elena wanted to understand clinically, and Vivian explained the mechanism in the detail Elena required. And they talked about the monitoring device Elena now wore and how it worked, and at some point they talked about the hearing, and Elena said, "I want to come." Vivian looked at her. I know it's not standard," Elena said. "I want to be there." "Elena, the attorneys would advise against—" "I'm not asking the attorneys." Elena looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you." Vivian held her gaze for a long moment. She thought about what Elena being in that courtroom would mean, the exposure, the risk, the way Rosa Cavallo's team would try to use her presence, her affect, every micro-expression on her face as data for their argument. She thought about what it would mean to Elena not to be there, to be the subject of a proceeding about her own life, and to be kept from it, managed out of it, treated as a variable rather than a person. "Let me talk to Webb," she said. Elena nodded once, the nod that meant, good enough for now. Webb's position, delivered at 7 in the evening with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and the particular directness of a litigator who respects the intelligence of the people he's briefing, was, "It's a risk. Rosa's team will try to rattle her, but a 12-year-old cardiac patient sitting calmly in a courtroom while her grandmother's attorneys attempt to characterize her home as a danger zone." He paused. "That's also a statement. If she can hold it." "She can hold it," Vivian said. Webb looked at her, then at Lorenzo. Lorenzo looked at Vivian. "She goes," Lorenzo said. The morning of the hearing, Vivian was awake at 4:30. She didn't try to go back to sleep. She made coffee and sat in the kitchen in the dark and looked at the winter garden through the window and thought about nothing specific, which was a skill she'd developed over years of clinical work. The ability to sit in the space before something without rehearsing it to death, to let the mind rest while the body stays present. At 5:15, Lorenzo came into the kitchen. He looked at her coffee and then at the pot and poured himself a cup and sat down at the table, not across from her but at the adjacent corner, close enough that the conversation didn't require volume. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When Rourke recommended you," he said, "I had you investigated independently, before I agreed to his recommendation." He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at it. "My own team. 3 weeks of background review." Vivian looked at him. "I knew your situation in detail before I ever had Rourke arrange the meeting," he said. "Your practice, Chen, the board investigation, the financial exposure." He paused. "I knew you were in a position where you would need what I was offering." "You used my vulnerability," she said. "I assessed it," he said, "which is the same thing, and I know it." He looked up from the cup. "I am not the same person I was 3 weeks ago in the ways that matter most, and I am also still the person who made that assessment and proceeded on it. Both of those things are true." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet and the dark was beginning to thin at the edges of the window. "I knew what I was walking into," she said. "Not all of it, but the shape of it." She picked up her coffee. "I made my own choice. Under conditions I helped create. Under conditions that were also the result of what David Chen did and what Rosa Cavallo's network arranged, and what the board did, and about 17 other things that aren't your fault. She looked at him steadily. You're not the only architect of my situation, Lorenzo. You're also not absolved of your part in it. She paused. We're clear. He looked at her. We're clear? He said. We're clear, she said. Now drink your coffee. We have 4 hours. Something moved in his face that was the shadow of the smile she'd seen on that first day, the one that hadn't quite decided to become a smile. This time it got slightly further. He drank his coffee. At 5:45, feet on the stairs, small ones. Mia appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, with her hair impossible and her expression that of someone who has calculated that being awake was more important than being asleep. She looked at both of them at the kitchen table. Is today the court day? She said. Yes, Vivian said. Mia came to the table and climbed into the chair beside Vivian. She looked at the window. The garden was beginning to appear in the early gray light. Will it be okay? She said. Vivian looked at Lorenzo. He looked at Vivian. Yes, Vivian said. Mia looked at the garden for a moment. Then she said, Saturn has a hexagonal storm at its north pole. It's been there for decades. Scientists don't completely understand why it doesn't dissipate. She paused. But it doesn't. It just stays. The kitchen was quiet. That's a good fact, Vivian said. Mia nodded solemnly. I thought so. But The courtroom was smaller than Vivian had expected and more ordinary. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the particular flat atmosphere of a municipal space that has processed too many human catastrophes to register any single one as exceptional. Judge Harriet Fong was 62, direct, and possessed of the specific patience of someone who has heard every version of every argument and is interested only in the version that holds up. Rosa Cavallo arrived with 4 attorneys and the composed authority of a woman who has moved through powerful spaces for so long that she's forgotten rooms look different to people who don't belong in them by default. She was in her late 60s, elegant, severe, with Sophia's bone structure and a face that had none of Sophia's warmth. She looked at Lorenzo when she entered, and the look contained 12 years of whatever she'd felt about the man her daughter had married. And then she looked at Vivian with the assessment of someone who has studied a file and is now calibrating the distance between the file and the person. She looked at Elena, sitting beside Lorenzo in the gallery. Something moved in Rosa's face. Vivian watched it. Not softness, something more complicated than softness. The expression of a woman who did love her granddaughter and had convinced herself, over 2 years of strategy and maneuvering, that love and the action she'd taken in love's name were the same thing. They were not the same thing. Vivian looked at Rosa Cavallo and felt no anger. She had spent 12 days in the wreckage of what Rosa had built, and she understood, with the clinical clarity that was her most reliable tool, that Rosa Cavallo was not a monster. She was a woman who had lost her daughter and had decided that the man who had not prevented that loss should not be permitted to keep what Sophia had left behind. She had converted grief into a strategy and had been moving inside that strategy for so long that she could no longer see the difference between what she wanted and what was right. Vivian had treated that pattern in children for 11 years. It was not simpler in adults. It was just larger. Marcus Webb opened for the DeMarco response. He was clean and precise and organized the case the way good attorneys organize cases. Not with drama, but with inevitability. Each piece of evidence placed so that the conclusion arrived before he stated it, so that stating it felt like confirmation rather than argument. He entered Vivian's clinical notes. He entered Voss's disclosure package. He entered the dietary and behavioral documentation of Mia's progress. He entered the school's updated assessment of Elena's engagement, which had improved significantly in the 2 weeks since Vivian's arrival, and which the school counselor had put in writing at Webb's request. He entered the Rourke disclosure carefully, with Carla Reyes's federal documentation supporting it, laying out the coordination between Rourke and the Cavallo network, the deliberate manufacture of the custody threat as a vehicle for asset acquisition, the use of Vivian's personal history as a weapon in a legal strategy designed not to protect children, but to control an inheritance. Rosa's lead attorney, a man named Clifford Ash, who had 35 years, and the particular confidence of someone who has never lost a case he expected to win, objected 3 times during the Rourke presentation. Judge Fong sustained none of them. Rosa's face, across the room, was very still. Ash's cross-examination of Vivian lasted 40 minutes. He was good. He was thorough. He went after the licensing suspension, the financial history, the speed of the marriage, the terms of the contract, the question of whether a woman in Vivian's position could genuinely exercise independent professional judgment in a household that controlled her economic survival. Vivian answered every question in the measured, precise language of her profession, and she did not perform composure. She was composed because she had been through enough in the past 3 weeks that Clifford Ash's questions, however sharp, were not the sharpest things she'd faced. When he asked whether her attachment to the DeMarco children had compromised her clinical objectivity, she said, "Therapeutic effectiveness in child psychology requires genuine relational investment. Clinical objectivity and personal attachment are not mutually exclusive. They require management. I have managed them." She paused. "The documentation shows the outcomes." Ash looked at her for a moment. "No further questions," he said. The hearing broke for lunch. In the hallway during the recess, Rosa Cavallo was there. But in the estate in Westchester County, in the garden where Sophia DeMarco had planted yellow climbing roses because hired gardeners didn't understand what a garden was for, the legend that mattered now was smaller and more specific and harder to build than anything the family had constructed before it. It was the legend of a Tuesday morning in June when 3 people stood in front of something that had come back, and one woman watched from a bench, and Mrs. Harrow made tea, and Mia said something about root structure, and Elena laughed, fully, without checking herself, without managing it. And the sound of it went up into the summer air and stayed there. That was the thing that had been fought for. That was what the winter had been for.